I want a lawyer. Those 4 words, spoken by Detective Blake Harrison from the witness stand in courtroom 14, would mark the exact moment when 20 years of getting away with it came crashing down around him like a building whose foundation had been rotting in secret for so long that when it finally gave way, there was nothing anyone could do but watch it fall and fall and fall until there was nothing left standing but rubble and the truth. They had him in handcuffs. They had Darnell Cooper sitting behind a defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that hung slightly loose on his shoulders, in a courtroom that smelled like mildew and broken promises, and the particular kind of institutional neglect that accumulates in places where the same injustices play out over and over, until the walls themselves seem to absorb the despair. They had a file full of planted evidence meticulously documented with the kind of paperwork that had always protected them before a compliant prosecutor who had learned long ago not to ask questions that might complicate the answers, and 20 years of precedent suggesting that this would end the way it always ended, with a conviction, a sentence, and one more black man disappearing into the machinery of a system that had been designed from its very inception to grind people who looked like him into dust. Detective Blake Harrison sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, arms folded across his chest, in that particular posture of certainty that comes from never having been held accountable for anything that mattered, wearing the quiet smirk of a man who had already written the ending to this story and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up and accept what he knew to be inevitable. His platinum blonde crew cut was freshly trimmed, his jaw set with the kind of arrogance that grows like a cancer when authority goes unchecked for too long, and his eyes, pale blue and flat as a frozen lake, held the expression of someone who had stopped seeing the people he arrested as human beings somewhere around year 6 on the force, and had never bothered to find his way back. Beside him sat Detective Tony Riggs, younger by more than a decade, maybe 33 years old, with close-cropped red hair that seemed to catch the fluorescent light in a way that made him look perpetually nervous, and eyes that darted around the courtroom. Too much the eyes of a man who was always calculating exits, always measuring distances, always preparing for the moment when everything went wrong, even as he told himself it never would. At the prosecution table, Amanda Cross sat with her blonde hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked like it hurt, organizing her files with the razor-sharp efficiency of someone who had built an entire career on high conviction rates and protected those numbers with the ferocity of someone who understood exactly how much they meant to her future, her reputation, her sense of self-worth in a profession that measured success in guilty verdicts and measured failure in everything else. And at the defense table alone sat Darnell Cooper, 41 years old, his expression like still water in a deep well, the kind of water where you can't tell the depth by looking at the surface, where you might think you understand what you're seeing until you realize that everything important is happening far below where your eyes can reach in places where the light doesn't penetrate, and the truth waits with the patience of something that knows it will eventually rise. Blake Harrison had no idea, not the faintest whisper of a clue, not the smallest flicker of intuition, that the man sitting in those handcuffs had been waiting for this exact moment for 3 years, that every second of those 3 years had been spent building toward this courtroom, this trial, this revelation, and that the ending. Blake Harrison had written in his mind with such absolute confidence was about to be shredded, set on fire, and buried so deep that no one would ever be able to dig it up again. Somewhere in the Riverside district of Ashford City, Mississippi, in a small apartment with walls so thin you could hear your neighbors' conversations whether you wanted to or not. A 10-year-old girl named Jasmine Tucker sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, her pencil moving across the page in careful loops as she practiced her cursive, completely unaware that the man sitting in that courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit was about to give her father back to her, was about to return. 19 months of stolen time was about to prove that the words her father had been saying all along, the words her grandmother Rosa had been repeating like a prayer that no one else seemed to hear, were true, and had always been true and would finally be recognized as true by people with the power to do something about it. What happens in the next 6 hours in that courtroom that smells like mildew and broken promises will shred everything Blake Harrison believes about power, about authority, about the fundamental architecture of a world that has always bent itself around his will, like gravity bending around a star. But to understand how we got here, how a man with no criminal record ended up in handcuffs facing 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and how the detective who put him there ended up destroying himself on the witness stand with 4 words spoken, in a voice that had finally, after 20 years, learned what fear sounded like. We need to go back to where it began. To an October night when the fog rolled through Ashford City like something ancient and hungry, and Blake Harrison made the mistake of thinking that one more arrest would be just like all the others that had come before. The night of October 19th began the way most catastrophic nights do, which is to say quietly, with nothing to suggest that the ordinary flow of time was about to break apart and reassemble itself into something that would change lives and end careers and send ripples through the world that would still be felt years later when people who weren't even born yet would study what happened as a case study in how power corrupts and how justice, when it finally arrives with a weight that can crush anything standing in its way. Darnell Cooper was driving a rented black Audi A8 through the Riverside district of Ashford City, a mid-sized metropolis in Mississippi that looked respectable from the highway with its new shopping centers and carefully maintained public parks, but rotted from the inside. Once you got past the welcome signs and started paying attention to which neighborhoods got their streetlights fixed and which ones didn't, which schools got new textbooks and which ones made do with books. So old the maps inside them still showed countries that didn't exist anymore. He was wearing a navy wool coat that his late father had saved up 3 months to buy him when Darnell graduated from Georgetown Law, a silver watch that same father had left him when the 3rd job finally put him in an early grave at 53 years old, and a calm expression that never changed regardless of what was happening around him. An expression that people who knew Darnell well said was like still water. You couldn't tell the depth by looking at the surface, couldn't guess what currents moved underneath, couldn't predict which way the tides would pull until it was too late to do anything but go where they took you. He stopped at a red light at the intersection of Brennan Avenue and 12th Street. His hands resting lightly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where the driver's education manual said they should be. His breathing even, and controlled the way it always was when he was preparing for something important, something that required absolute focus and the kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly what was at stake and exactly what needed to happen next. A police cruiser pulled up beside him in the left lane, and Darnell didn't look over, didn't make eye contact, didn't do anything that might be interpreted as aggressive or suspicious or deserving of attention, just sat there like any other driver waiting for a light to change, like any other person trying to get from one place to another without incident. The light turned green and Darnell drove exactly 4 blocks, maintaining precisely the speed limit, signaling his turns with textbook precision, doing everything exactly right in the way that black men in America learned to do everything exactly right. Because doing everything exactly right is sometimes the only defense you have against a world that is looking for any excuse, any justification, any reason at all to decide that you deserve whatever happens to you next. The police cruiser's lights exploded behind him at 11:38 p.m., red and blue strobing through the October fog like a warning from something ancient, like the flash of lightning before the thunder arrives, and shakes the foundations of your house and reminds you that some forces are so much larger than you that resistance is just another word for hubris. Darnell pulled over to the curb immediately. No hesitation, no attempt to drive another block to find a better lit area or a more public location. Just immediate compliance with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from having done this before, from knowing exactly what the script demanded and knowing that any deviation from that script could be interpreted as resistance, and resistance could be interpreted as aggression, and aggression could be interpreted as a threat, and threats got people killed. He placed both hands on the steering wheel in plain sight, exactly where any officer approaching the window would be able to see them without question, without ambiguity, without any possibility of misinterpretation, whether accidental or deliberate. He kept his breathing even in through his nose for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out through his mouth for 4 counts. The kind of breathing they teach you for managing anxiety and staying calm under pressure. The kind of breathing he'd been practicing for 3 years while he built this case piece by piece and waited for the right moment to spring a trap that had taken longer to construct than some people spend earning their college degrees. He had done this before, not this exactly, but something close enough that the muscle memory kicked in automatically. The knowledge of what to do with your hands, where to look with your eyes, how to modulate your voice so it carried no threat. No anger, no emotion at all, beyond calm compliance with whatever was about to be demanded of you. Every black man in America has done this before, has felt the peculiar cocktail of fear and anger and resignation that comes from being pulled over for no reason you can identify as calculated in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Whether this stop will be routine, or whether this will be the stop that changes everything. The stop that ends with handcuffs, or worse, the stop that your family will have to explain to your children who don't understand yet that the color of your skin is something that some people see as justification for treating you like you're guilty of something, even when you've done nothing at all. The officer who approached his window was Detective First Class Blake Harrison. Though Darnell wouldn't learn the man's full name and rank for another 6 hours, wouldn't have it confirmed in the official documentation until the arrest report was filed and the booking process was complete. And he was sitting in a holding cell waiting for the next phase of his plan to unfold exactly the way he'd mapped it out in the conference rooms and federal offices where this operation had been designed, with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that the architects of the operation itself would have recognized if they'd been capable of recognizing anything beyond their own certainty that they would never be caught. What Darnell saw in that first moment was a wide-shouldered white man in his mid-40s with platinum blonde hair cut in a crew cut so precise it looked like it had been measured with a ruler. A jaw set with the particular kind of arrogance that grows like mold in dark places when authority goes unchecked for too long, and eyes the color of faded denim that had stopped seeing the people they looked at as people somewhere around year 6 on the force, and had never bothered in all the years since to find their way back to anything resembling empathy or compassion, or the basic human recognition that the person on the other side of your badge is someone's son, someone's father, someone's whole world. Blake Harrison had been with the Ashford City Police Department for 20 years, a fact he mentioned frequently and with obvious pride, as if longevity in itself was a virtue regardless of what you did with that time, regardless of how many people you hurt, regardless of how many lives you destroyed while wearing a badge that was supposed to mean you were there to protect and serve. He had received 5 commendations over those 20 years' plaques and certificates that hung on the wall of his office, and testified to his excellence in the eyes of a department that measured excellence in arrests and convictions without asking too many questions about how those arrests were made, or whether those convictions were built on foundations of truth or foundations of something else entirely. He had also accumulated 3 formal complaints that had disappeared before they were investigated, vanishing into the particular bureaucratic void that exists in police departments where certain officers are protected by other officers who have their own reasons for making sure that uncomfortable questions never get asked and uncomfortable answers never see the light of day. And he had one internal affairs file that had been sealed under circumstances that nobody wanted to talk about, sealed so thoroughly that even people with significant authority and federal warrants had trouble accessing it, sealed in a way that suggested that whatever was in that file was bad enough that keeping it hidden was worth calling in favors and applying pressure and making sure that anyone who tried to look too closely understood that looking too closely was a career-limiting move. Behind Blake, climbing out of the passenger side of the cruiser with the slightly awkward movements of someone who still wasn't entirely comfortable with the weight of the equipment belt around his waist, was Detective Tony Riggs, younger, maybe 33, with close-cropped red hair and eyes that darted around too much. Eyes that were always calculating, always measuring, always looking for exits, like a man who expected at any moment to need one. Tony Riggs had been Blake Harrison's partner for 7 years, and everyone in the Ashford City Police Department knew that wherever Blake went, Tony followed. And wherever Tony followed, things had a way of going badly for people who couldn't protect themselves, for people who didn't have lawyers on speed dial or family members with connections, or the kind of social capital that makes police officers think twice before deciding that your night is going to end in handcuffs. Blake Harrison approached the driver's side window with his hand resting casually on his service weapon, not drawing it, not threatening with it, just letting that hand rest there in a way that communicated volumes about power and authority and the fundamental inequality of the situation unfolding here on this dark street in the Riverside district, where the streetlights had been broken for 3 weeks and nobody from the city had bothered to come fix them. "License and registration," Blake said, and the words came out clipped and final. Not "please," not "sir," not "good evening," or any of the other small courtesies that people extend to each other when they're engaging as equals. Just those 3 words delivered in a tone that suggested he was already bored with this transaction, already thinking about the paperwork he'd have to file, and the coffee that was waiting for him back at the station, and the way this arrest would look on his record when he went up for his next promotion. Darnell handed over both documents without comment, without questions, without doing anything that might be interpreted as non-compliance. His movements slow and deliberate and clearly visible, so there could be no confusion. No claim later that he'd been reaching for something. No justification for the kind of escalation that turned traffic stops into headlines and hashtags, and another name added to a list that was already far too long. Blake studied the documents with the exaggerated slowness of a man performing authority, rather than exercising it looking at Darnell's driver's license, like he was reading a novel holding the rental car agreement up to the light from his flashlight, like he was examining it for forgeries, taking his time in a way that had nothing to do with thoroughness and everything to do with establishing dominance, with making sure Darnell understood exactly who had the power here and who did not. "Step out of the vehicle," Blake said finally, and there was something in his voice that Darnell recognized immediately. The sound of a decision that had already been made, of a conclusion that had been reached before the first question was asked, of a verdict that existed before any evidence was examined. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Darnell asked, his voice calm and respectful and empty of any challenge or confrontation. Just a simple question asked in the tone of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what was happening. Blake's eyes went flat, completely flat, like windows into a room where all the lights had been turned off and nothing lived anymore except the kind of certainty that came from never having been questioned, never having been challenged, never having been told that maybe, just maybe, you were wrong. "Broken taillight." Blake said the words coming out with the kind of casual authority that suggested this was obviously true and obviously sufficient justification for everything that was about to happen next. "Step out of the vehicle." The tail light was not broken, a fact that Darnell knew with absolute certainty because he had checked every single light on the rental car when he picked it up from the agency that afternoon at 3:42 p.m., had walked around the entire vehicle with one of the rental company's mechanics, had specifically asked Daniel Green, the certified mechanic whose signature was on the inspection form, to verify that every external light was in full working order, had even taken photographs on his phone showing the functioning taillights just to make absolutely sure there would be documentary evidence of the car's condition at the moment he took possession of it. He checked everything. Always checked everything, had spent 3 years checking everything because he knew that when this moment finally arrived, when the trap finally sprang, there could be no gaps, no uncertainties, no places where Blake Harrison's lawyers could insert doubt and build reasonable explanations and convince a jury that maybe their client was telling the truth and maybe this whole thing was just a misunderstanding. But Darnell stepped out of the vehicle anyway, because refusing would have been resistance, and resistance would have given Blake exactly the justification he needed to escalate this situation into something that Darnell couldn't control, and control was everything. Control was the whole point. Control was what separated a successful operation from a disaster that ended with Darnell dead in the street and Blake Harrison filing a report about how he'd had no choice, how the suspect had been aggressive, how everything had happened so fast that there was no time to consider alternatives. What happened in the next 4 minutes happened fast and with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. So many times that the movements had become automatic muscle memory, a choreography of corruption so well rehearsed that they barely needed to communicate with each other anymore, could coordinate their actions with just a glance, a nod, a subtle shift in position that told each of them exactly what role they were playing and exactly when to execute their part of the performance. Tony Riggs moved to the passenger side of the Audi while Blake kept Darnell standing by the driver's door, his hands on the roof of the car, his feet spread in the position that every cop show on television has made instantly recognizable, the position that communicates submission and compliance and the absolute surrender of control over your own body to someone else's authority. Blake announced that he was going to conduct a pat-down for officer safety, and Darnell submitted without protest, without complaint, without any of the anger that was building in his chest like pressure behind a dam, because he knew that every second of this encounter was being recorded by the lapel pin camera hidden in his coat, disguised as a simple piece of jewelry that no one would look at twice, capturing video in high definition with a clarity that would make absolutely certain that when this footage was played in court there would be no question about what happened, no ambiguity about who did what, no possibility of misinterpretation. During those 40 seconds when Darnell's hands were on the roof of the rental car and Blake Harrison's hands were moving along his sides, patting down his pockets with the kind of casual invasiveness that suggested this was routine, that this happened every day, that there was nothing remarkable about a police officer putting his hands on a stranger's body without any real justification beyond the vague invocation of officer safety. Tony Riggs reached into the rental car's glove compartment and placed something there. A small vacuum-sealed bag containing what appeared to be approximately 45 grams of cocaine, the bag itself marked with a specific batch number that forensic analysis would later reveal. Matched cocaine seized in 3 other cases separated by months and involving completely different defendants, which meant that the drugs being planted in 4 different people's vehicles had all come from the same source, had all been held in the same evidence room, had all been repurposed from their original legitimate seizures into tools of corruption that could be deployed whenever Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs decided they needed another arrest to pad their statistics or satisfy a quota, or simply because they could, because they'd been doing it for so long without consequences, that the idea of consequences had become abstract theoretical, something that happened to other people in other places, but never to them. The movement was practiced smooth so quick that if you weren't watching for it specifically, you might miss it entirely. Might see Tony Riggs standing by the passenger side of the vehicle and assume he was doing exactly what Blake had said he was doing, securing the perimeter, maintaining safety, following standard police procedure for a traffic stop. But the camera hidden in Darnell's lapel pin was watching for it. Specifically was pointed at exactly the right angle, was capturing every frame of Tony Riggs leaning into the passenger window, his hand moving toward the glove compartment with the kind of casual certainty that came from having done this exact motion dozens of times before opening that compartment, his hand disappearing inside for just a moment, just long enough, and then withdrawing empty now, the bag transferred, the evidence planted, the trap set. When Blake Harrison walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle 40 seconds later, and opened the passenger door with the kind of theatrical deliberateness that suggested he was being careful, being thorough, being professional in his examination of the vehicle. And when he leaned in and looked into the glove compartment that Tony Riggs had just finished preparing for exactly this moment, his face transformed into an expression of surprise that was trying very hard to look genuine, but instead looked exactly like what it was, which was a performance that had been given so many times before that the actor had stopped bothering to make it convincing and was just going through the motions because the audience had never complained before and probably wouldn't complain now. "Well, I'll be damned," Blake said slowly, drawing out the words like he was genuinely shocked. Like this was the last thing he had expected to find, like the universe had just delivered him a surprise instead of exactly what he and his partner had deliberately placed there less than 2 minutes ago. Darnell Cooper's expression didn't change, not even slightly, not even a flicker of surprise or anger or fear. His face remaining as still and calm as that deep water we talked about earlier. The kind of water where you can't see the bottom and can't guess what's moving underneath the surface until it's ready to reveal itself. The still water didn't ripple, didn't give anything away, didn't offer Blake Harrison or Tony Riggs or anyone watching any indication of what Darnell was thinking or feeling or planning, didn't provide any of the satisfaction that Blake was probably looking for. The satisfaction of seeing someone break under pressure, seeing fear creep into their eyes, seeing the moment when they realized that they were completely and utterly powerless to stop what was about to happen to them. Darnell was arrested, the handcuffs clicking around his wrists with that particular metallic sound that you hear in movies, but that carries a completely different weight when it's your own. Wrists, your own freedom being mechanically restricted, your own autonomy being removed by someone who has decided for reasons that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power that you no longer get to control your own movement through the world. He was read his Miranda rights in a tone that suggested the officer reciting them found the whole procedure tiresome, an obligation imposed by courts that didn't understand the realities of police work. A formality that had to be observed but didn't deserve any real attention or respect because everyone involved knew that these rights were theoretical constructs that existed on paper but rarely survived contact with the actual machinery of the criminal justice system. He was placed in the back of the police cruiser, his hands cuffed behind him in a position that was deliberately uncomfortable, designed to make the suspect tractable and compliant. His silver watch pressing into his wrist in a way that would leave a mark, a physical reminder of this moment that would last for days after the handcuffs were finally removed. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb and began the drive to the Ashford City Police Department's holding facility, Blake Harrison glanced in the rearview mirror at the man sitting in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him and his expression still completely unreadable, still that deep, still water that gave nothing away, and said to Tony Riggs, quietly, almost cheerfully, with the kind of casual satisfaction that came from a job well done, "Another one off the street." Tony Riggs laughed, the sound sharp and genuine. The laugh of someone who genuinely believed that what they had just done was not only acceptable, but actually virtuous, actually contributing to public safety, actually making the world a better place by removing from it someone who in their estimation probably deserved to be removed, regardless of whether they had actually committed the crime they were being arrested for. And Darnell Cooper sitting in the back seat of that police cruiser with his hands cuffed behind him and his silver watch pressing into his wrist hard enough to hurt, and the fog-wrapped streets of Ashford City sliding past the window like scenes from someone else's life, thought to himself, quiet and certain, and with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing that everything was proceeding exactly according to plan good. Now we begin. The Ashford City Police Department's holding facility smelled like bleach and despair in equal measure, a combination so specific and so pervasive that it seemed to have soaked into the walls over years of use, decades, maybe accumulating in layers like sediment at the bottom of a lake, until the smell became part of the architecture itself, indistinguishable from the concrete and the steel and the flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency that seemed specifically designed to erode a person's sense of time, to make minutes feel like hours and hours feel like days, until you lost track entirely of how long you'd been sitting in this place that existed outside the normal flow of the world. Darnell was processed at 11:52 p.m., just 14 minutes after Blake Harrison had discovered the planted cocaine in his glove compartment and announced with that theatrical surprise that he was going to have to place Darnell under arrest 14 minutes during which Darnell had sat in the back of the police cruiser and watched the streets of Ashford City scroll past and thought about the 3 years of work that had led to this moment. The hundreds of hours spent building this case piece by piece, interview by interview, document by document, until the architecture of Blake Harrison's corruption was so thoroughly mapped and documented that there would be no escape, no exit, no last-minute legal maneuver that could make the evidence disappear or the victims recant or the truth become negotiable. The processing was mechanical, impersonal, executed with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that treated human beings like inventory being logged into a warehouse system, photographed from the front and from both sides, fingerprinted with ink that smeared across his fingertips and wouldn't fully wash off for days, stripped of his watch and his phone and his wallet and his coat and everything else that connected him to his identity as a person who existed in the world outside this facility. Everything that might remind him or anyone else that he was something more than just another case number in the system. The officer doing the intake processing was a young man named Corporal Lance Edwards, maybe 26 years old, who typed everything into the computer with the mechanical disinterest of someone filling out a grocery order, his eyes on the screen rather than on Darnell's face, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed as he reduced a human being to a series of data points: name, date of birth, height, weight, identifying marks, charges, arresting officers. While Lance Edwards typed, Blake Harrison stood at the counter and he talked the way men talk when they've stopped being afraid of consequences loosely, and with their chests out, filling the silence with the sound of their own certainty, performing confidence for an audience that might or might not be paying attention, but that would definitely remember later when everything fell apart. How absolutely sure Blake had seemed that this was just another arrest, just another drug dealer off the streets, just another successful operation in a career built on successful operations. 45 grams, Blake said, to nobody in particular, to the room in general, to anyone who might be listening and validating his narrative of what had just happened. That's intent to distribute, no question about it. The DA is going to love this one. Clean arrest, clean evidence. No complications, no problems. Just another scumbag who thought he could drive through Riverside with enough cocaine to supply half the district and nobody would notice or care. Tony Riggs was leaning against the wall, scrolling through his phone with the kind of distracted attention that suggested he was only half listening to Blake's monologue, that he'd heard this same speech so many times before that it had become background noise. Something that happened after every arrest, regardless of the specific details. "What's his story?" Tony asked without looking up from his phone, his thumb moving across the screen as he checked messages or scrolled through social media or did whatever people do with their phones when they're trying to look busy and avoid actual conversation. Not a word, Blake replied, and there was something in his voice that might have been irritation or might have been grudging respect, hard to tell which. Just stared at me the whole ride like he was memorizing my face, like he thought that was going to accomplish something, like I'm supposed to be intimidated by some drug dealer giving me the silent treatment. Blake snorted a sound of dismissal and contempt, the laugh of someone who had seen it all before and wasn't impressed by anything anymore. "Let him stare," he said. "Doesn't matter what he memorizes, doesn't matter what he thinks he knows, or what he thinks he's going to do about it. Because where he's going, none of that matters where he's going. The only thing that matters is time, and how much of it he's going to spend behind bars, thinking about the choices that led him here." Darnell was placed in a holding cell at 12:20 a.m., almost 40 minutes after the traffic stop that had transformed him from a free man driving through the Riverside district into a defendant facing 20 years in federal prison on charges that he not only didn't commit, but that had been manufactured specifically for the purpose of giving Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs another arrest to add to their statistics, another conviction to pad their records. Another victim to add to the list of people whose lives they had destroyed for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the particular kind of power that comes from wearing a badge and knowing that the system will believe you over anyone you decide to target. The holding cell contained 3 other men when Darnell was escorted in by a corrections officer who unlocked the door with a ring of keys that jangled like wind chimes, and then locked it again behind Darnell with a metallic clang that echoed in the small space and reminded everyone inside that they were here at someone else's pleasure, that their freedom had been suspended, that time itself had taken on a different quality, now that it was being measured out in increments determined by courts and judges and lawyers, rather than by their own choices about where to go and what to do. There was a young kid, maybe 20 years old, sitting on the bench with his arms wrapped around his knees and his face pressed against his forearms, clearly terrified in the way that people are terrified the first time they're arrested, when the reality of what's happening hasn't fully sunk in yet. But the fear is already overwhelming, already shutting down their ability to think clearly or plan rationally or do anything except try to make themselves as small as possible and hope that somehow this will all turn out to be a mistake. There was an older heavy-set man sleeping on the opposite bench, snoring with a rattling sound that suggested sleep apnea or a lifetime of smoking or both. His body sprawled in the kind of position that suggested he'd done this before. That holding cells were familiar enough territory that he could sleep through the fear and the uncertainty and the fluorescent lights that never turned off. And there was a wiry man with a tattoo on his neck, some kind of design that Darnell couldn't make out from across the cell, who studied Darnell for a long moment with the kind of assessment that people make when they're trying to figure out if you're a threat or an ally or just another piece of furniture in a room they're stuck in for the foreseeable future, and then nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or recognition or simple human courtesy in a place where courtesy was in short supply, and returned to his own business. Whatever that was, staring at the wall, or thinking his own thoughts, or counting time in his head. Darnell sat down on the bench, not too close to the terrified young man and not too close to the sleeping older man, finding that middle distance that communicated that he wasn't looking for conversation, but wasn't hostile to it either. And he rested his arms on his knees and folded his hands together and waited. Because waiting was what he'd been preparing himself to do. Waiting was part of the plan. Waiting was how you got from this moment to the next one without panicking or breaking or giving away any of the information that needed to stay hidden until exactly the right moment. He had been preparing for this night for 38 months, which is 3 years and 2 months if you count it out in calendar time, which is a long time to carry a secret, a long time to build a case. A long time to walk through the world knowing that you're working towards something massive and transformative, but unable to tell anyone about it. Unable to share the weight of it with anyone except the handful of people who were directly involved in the operation and who understood the importance of keeping every detail locked down tight until the trap was ready to spring. But let's be precise about who Darnell Cooper was, because the courtroom would eventually make this very clear. Would eventually strip away all the assumptions and reveal the truth in a way that would leave everyone who had made those assumptions feeling like they'd been slapped across the face with reality. But in that holding cell in those hours before dawn, when time moves differently and the world outside seems very far away, he was just a man in a cage, and the system around him was operating exactly the way it had been designed to operate when it encountered men who looked like him. Darnell had grown up in the Pinewood neighborhood of Atlanta, not the wealthy part of Atlanta that gets featured in magazines and tourism brochures. Not the part with the restored Victorian houses and the trendy restaurants and the farmers' markets where you can buy organic vegetables for prices that would make your grandmother weep. But the other Atlanta, the one that exists in the spaces between the gentrification and the investment. The one where people work 2 jobs and still struggle to pay rent, where kids go to schools with broken windows and textbooks from the 1990s, and teachers who are doing their absolute best with resources that would be laughable if they weren't so tragic. He'd grown up in a single-parent household with a mother named Grace, who worked 2 jobs, one as a nursing assistant at a hospital, and one cleaning offices at night, coming home so exhausted that she'd sometimes fall asleep, sitting up at the kitchen table with her work shoes still on, and a father named Samuel who worked 3 jobs until the 3rd one, the overnight security shift that he'd taken to try to save enough money to move the family to a better neighborhood, put so much strain on his heart that it finally gave up on him one Tuesday morning when he was 48 years old and should have had decades left to live. Darnell had been sharp since childhood. The kind of sharp that teachers sometimes recognized and sometimes resented, the kind of intelligence that made him ask questions that complicated the lessons, that made him point out inconsistencies in what he was being taught, that made some adults smile and encourage him, and made other adults tell him to sit down and be quiet and stop thinking he was better than everyone else just because he could read above his grade level. He'd earned a scholarship to Morehouse College, one of the historically black colleges that had been educating students since before the Civil War ended, producing generations of doctors and lawyers and teachers and business leaders who went out into the world and proved over and over again that talent and intelligence and drive had nothing to do with the color of your skin and everything to do with whether you were given the opportunity to develop those qualities, or whether they were crushed under the weight of a system that saw you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be nurtured. From Morehouse, he'd gotten a full ride to Georgetown Law, one of the top law schools in the country, where he graduated 4th in his class, missing 3rd place by a fraction of a point. That still bothered him sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, even though he knew intellectually that the difference between 3rd and 4th place meant absolutely nothing in the long run, that employers looked at your overall record rather than your exact class ranking, that success was measured in decades rather than in the tiny gradations that separated one law student from another. He'd clerked for a federal judge in the 11th Circuit, spending a year learning how the federal court system actually worked from the inside, watching how cases were argued and decided, understanding the difference between the law as it was written in books and the law as it was actually practiced by human beings with their own biases and assumptions and blind spots. He'd worked 8 years as an assistant United States attorney, prosecuting organized crime and public corruption cases with a conviction rate that made older attorneys uncomfortable in the way that excellence sometimes does, in the way that watching someone younger than you excel at something you've been doing for decades can make you question your own competence, your own commitment, your own willingness to do the hard work that real excellence requires, rather than just going through the motions and collecting a paycheck. 3 years ago, Darnell Cooper had been appointed to a position that most people in that holding cell, most people in Ashford City, most people in America probably would have never guessed existed a position so specialized and so classified that even other federal prosecutors sometimes didn't know exactly what it entailed or why it was necessary or what kind of person you had to be to take on that kind of work. Special Investigative Counsel to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division Office of Police Accountability. A title that sounded bureaucratic and boring, but that actually meant something very specific and very important. His job was to build prosecutable federal cases against law enforcement agencies engaged in organized evidence, planting civil rights violations and patterns of corruption that were so deeply embedded in the culture of those agencies that they couldn't be rooted out by normal oversight mechanisms, by internal affairs, investigations that got buried by citizen complaints that disappeared by journalists asking questions that never got answered. His specific mandate, his very specific, very classified mandate, that had been spelled out in a letter signed by the deputy director of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division and countersigned by 2 senior attorneys who understood exactly how dangerous this work was and how much it mattered, was to identify police departments where corruption had become routine, where the abuse of power had become so normalized that the officers engaging in it didn't even see it as corruption anymore, just saw it as the way things were done, the way they'd always been done, the way they would continue to be done, unless someone with enough authority and enough evidence stepped in and made it stop. He had been investigating the Ashford City Police Department for 38 months, since the day he received a tip from a lawyer representing a man named Isaiah Tucker, who swore his client was innocent of the drug charges that were about to send him to prison. For 5 years, a lawyer who had looked at the evidence and the arrest report, and something hadn't added up, something hadn't made sense, something had triggered her instinct that this case wasn't what it appeared to be. He had been investigating Blake Harrison specifically for 24 of those 38 months, since the pattern analysis software he'd been running had identified Blake's name appearing in connection with 12 different drug arrests over a 5-year period, all of them in the Riverside District, all of them involving black defendants, all of them following the same basic script traffic stop for a minor violation search of the vehicle discovery of drugs in quantities large enough to trigger intent to distribute charges, arrest, prosecution, conviction. 12 arrests that looked completely legitimate when you examined them one at a time, that fit all the procedural requirements, that had proper documentation and chain of custody records and lab analysis confirming that yes, these were real drugs. This was real cocaine or real methamphetamine or real whatever the charges said. They were nothing obviously wrong, nothing that would trigger red flags in a system that processed thousands of arrests every year and didn't have time to look too closely at any individual case. But when you looked at all 12 arrests together, when you mapped them on a timeline and cross-referenced the evidence and ran forensic analysis on the drugs themselves, a pattern emerged. A pattern that suggested these weren't 12 independent incidents, but 12 iterations of the same operation, 12 executions of the same script. 12 examples of Blake Harrison and whoever was helping him using their badges to plant evidence and destroy lives because they could, because they'd been doing it for so long without consequences that the idea of getting caught had become abstract, theoretical, something that happened in movies but never in real life. In the holding cell at 2 a.m, when time has lost all meaning and the fluorescent lights have been buzzing for so long that the sound has become part of the background noise of existence. One of the other inmates, the young, terrified one who had finally lifted his face from his arms and was looking around the cell like he was seeing it for the first time, asked Darnell what he was in for. The kid's name, Darnell would learn later, was Jamal, just 19 years old, arrested for a traffic violation that had somehow escalated into resisting arrest, even though Jamal's swollen eye and split lip suggested pretty clearly who had been doing the resisting and who had been doing the arresting. Darnell looked at him, at this kid who was barely old enough to vote, who probably still lived with his parents, who had his whole life ahead of him, and who was now going to have an arrest record that would follow him forever, that would come up every time he applied for a job, or tried to rent an apartment, or filled out any of the 1,000 forms that modern life requires. And he said simply, with no elaboration, "Planted evidence." Jamal nodded slowly, and the nod suggested that this was not a surprising answer, that the idea of police officers planting evidence was not some shocking revelation, but rather a known risk, a understood possibility, something that people in certain neighborhoods talked about, the way other people talked about the weather or traffic. Just another hazard of existing in a body that some people saw as inherently criminal, regardless of what you actually did. "You got a lawyer?" Jamal asked, and there was something in his voice that suggested he already knew the answer, that he'd learned from experience or from watching other people go through this process, that having a good lawyer was the difference between walking out of here and spending years in a cage. "I have access to one," Darnell said, carefully choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that anything he said in a holding cell might be overheard, might be repeated, might end up in some report somewhere. Public Defender Jamal asked, and the way he said it suggested that he already knew what public defenders were like, overwhelmed and underfunded, and doing their best with impossible caseloads that meant they could only spend a few minutes on each case before they had to move on to the next one. "No," Darnell said. "Not a public defender." He didn't say more than that, didn't elaborate, didn't explain, because explaining would have meant revealing things that needed to stay hidden for a few more days, for just long enough for the trap to finish closing, for Blake Harrison to testify under oath, for the video evidence to be entered into the record, for everything to become public and official, and impossible to bury or deny or explain away. He just sat there in the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the smell of bleach and despair, and he waited because waiting was what he'd been trained to do, what he'd been practicing for 38 months, what separated successful undercover operations from disasters that got people killed and let the guilty go free. The Ashford City District Attorney's Office was run by a man named Franklin Pierce, 58 years old, a career politician who had been district attorney for 13 years and had the kind of well-tailored confidence that comes from never having lost anything that mattered from winning election after election by margins large enough that he'd stopped worrying about whether his policies were actually serving justice and started focusing primarily on whether they would look good in campaign advertisements. Franklin was tall and silver-haired and possessed of a handshake so firm it bordered on aggression, the kind of handshake that communicated dominance and confidence and the absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any room he entered, and if you didn't agree with that assessment, then you simply weren't paying attention. He was not a stupid man, which needs to be said clearly, because what happened next wasn't about stupidity, wasn't about someone being too dumb to see what was right in front of them, but rather about someone who had made his peace with the machinery of his office, including the parts of the machinery that bent that didn't quite work the way they were supposed to, that produced outcomes that didn't always align with what the law said should happen, but that aligned perfectly well with what Franklin Pierce needed to happen in order to maintain his conviction rate and his reputation and his political future. Franklin's lead prosecutor on drug cases was a woman named Amanda Cross, 43 years old, efficient, razor-precise, with a reputation for high conviction rates that she protected with the ferocity of someone who understood exactly how much those numbers meant to her career, how much they determined whether she'd be stuck prosecuting drug cases for the rest of her professional life or whether she'd get promoted to handling more prestigious cases, whether she'd eventually make it to a judgeship herself, or whether she'd plateau at this level and watch younger attorneys pass her by. Amanda was not corrupt in the way that Blake Harrison was corrupt, was not deliberately and consciously choosing to do things that she knew were wrong, was not waking up every morning and looking at herself in the mirror and deciding that today she would subvert justice for personal gain. She was corrupt in a subtler, more common way. Corrupt in the way that people become corrupt when they stop asking questions that might complicate the answers they want to hear, when they start believing that their job is to win cases rather than to seek truth when they define justice, largely as conviction rates, and define their own success largely as how many people they can send to prison regardless of whether those people actually deserve to be there. When Amanda received the file on Darnell Cooper at 7:45 a.m., the morning after his arrest, delivered to her desk by a clerk who set it down on top of the stack of other files that represented other people's lives being processed through the machinery, she reviewed it in exactly 14 minutes, which was actually longer than she spent on most cases. A fact that would have been depressing if anyone had stopped to think about it, about how little time prosecutors spent actually examining the evidence before making decisions that would determine whether someone spent the next 5 or 10 or 20 years in prison. 45 grams of cocaine found in the vehicle, she noted, making a check mark on the intake form, significant quantity well above the threshold for intent to distribute. This was going to be an easy case, the kind of case that prosecutors loved because the evidence was straightforward and the defendant would probably plead guilty rather than go to trial. And even if they did go to trial, the jury would see those 45 grams, and that would be the end of the discussion. Clean chain of custody documentation she noted next, and this was important because chain of custody was where defense attorneys usually tried to attack drug cases, arguing that the evidence had been contaminated or mishandled, or could have been tampered with between the seizure and the trial. But Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs were always meticulous about their paperwork, always made sure that every form was filled out correctly and every signature was in the right place, and every timestamp was documented. And that meticulousness was one of the reasons they'd never been caught. One of the reasons their cases always held up in court. One of the reasons that prosecutors like Amanda Cross trusted them completely and never bothered to look any deeper than the surface of what they were being told. Defendant had no prior record. Amanda noted briefly, and this was unusual because most people arrested for intent to distribute quantities of drugs had some prior involvement with the criminal justice system, some earlier arrest for possession or paraphernalia, or something else that suggested a pattern of criminal behavior. But no priors wasn't disqualifying, wasn't enough to make her question whether this arrest was legitimate. just meant that this was someone who had been lucky enough to avoid getting caught before and had finally run out of luck. She set bail at $80,000, a number that would be difficult for most people to meet, a number that would keep Darnell Cooper in custody until his trial, unless he had family with money or access to a bail bondsman who was willing to take a risk on him. And Amanda set that number without any real thought about whether it was appropriate or whether it served any legitimate purpose beyond keeping someone who hadn't been convicted of anything locked up in a cage because the system assumed he was guilty, even though the presumption of innocence was supposed to be a fundamental principle of American justice. She scheduled the arraignment for 3 days out, which was the standard timeline, enough time for the paperwork to be processed, and the public defender's office to be notified, and the defendant to be transported from the holding facility to the courthouse for his first appearance before a judge. Nobody at the district attorney's office ran Darnell Cooper's name through the federal databases, the ones that would have immediately flagged him as a federal prosecutor, as someone with top-secret clearance, as someone whose employment information was classified at a level that required special authorization to access. Nobody called his employer to verify the address and phone number listed on his arrest report, which would have connected them to a line at the Department of Justice that would have triggered a series of very urgent conversations and very immediate interventions. Nobody asked why a man with no criminal record was driving through the Riverside district at 11:38 at night with 45 grams of cocaine in his glove compartment. Why someone who appeared to have no history of drug involvement would suddenly be caught with intent to distribute quantities. Why the story Blake Harrison was telling didn't quite make sense if you stopped to think about it for more than the 14 minutes that Amanda Cross had spent reviewing the file. Nobody asked why the rental car agreement in Darnell's name showed no prior issues with the vehicle, why there was no documentation of the broken taillight that Blake Harrison claimed was the reason for the traffic stop, why the timeline of events seemed just slightly off if you looked at it carefully. They saw what they expected to see, which was another black man arrested with drugs, another case that fit the pattern they'd seen 1,000 times before. Another file that would move through the system exactly the way all the other files moved through the system, and they moved forward with the efficiency of a bureaucracy that had learned long ago that asking certain questions was bad for throughput, bad for conviction rates, bad for the smooth operation of the machinery that processed human beings like widgets in a factory. Darnell Cooper made one phone call from a landline in the holding cell facility at 8:15 a.m., more than 8 hours after his arrest, after he'd spent the night sitting on that bench in the fluorescent light listening to the sounds of other people's misery and waiting for the sun to come up and for the next phase of his plan to begin. He called a number in Washington, D.C., a direct line that bypassed all the normal switchboards and secretaries and screening processes that usually protected senior federal officials from random phone calls, a number that only a handful of people in the entire country had access to. And the phone rang exactly twice before a woman answered. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Moss, and she was the Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, a position that made her one of the most powerful people in federal law enforcement, even though most Americans had never heard her name and wouldn't recognize her face if she walked past them on the street, which was exactly how she preferred it, because the work she did was more effective when nobody knew she was doing it. Her voice, when she heard Darnell's voice on the other end of the line, shifted immediately from the professional neutrality she used for normal business calls to something more alert, more focused, more intense, the voice of someone who had been waiting for this call and who understood immediately what it meant. "Tell me," she said just those 2 words. No greeting, no pleasantries. Just a direct command to give her the information she needed to assess the situation and decide what needed to happen next. It happened. Darnell said his own voice calm and even, despite the fact that he was standing in a police station in handcuffs having just spent the night in a holding cell, despite the fact that everything he'd been working toward for 3 years had just reached a critical inflection point and could either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically depending on what happened in the next few days. Harrison and Riggs, exactly as we expected. exactly as documented in the previous 9 cases. The same script, the same movements, the same fake surprise when they discovered the drugs they'd just planted. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just a moment of silence while Evelyn Moss processed this information and ran through all the implications in her mind, all the things that needed to happen now and all the things that absolutely could not happen, all the ways this could go right and all the ways it could go wrong. "Are you all right?" she asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice, because Evelyn Moss was not the kind of person who sent people into danger without caring about whether they came out the other side, was not the kind of administrator who saw her subordinates as chess pieces to be sacrificed for strategic advantage, but rather someone who understood that the people doing this work were human beings with families and lives and futures that mattered just as much as the mission itself. "Completely," Darnell said. And it was true, he was all right. Physically and emotionally and psychologically, was handling the stress and the danger exactly the way he'd been trained to handle it. Exactly the way he'd prepared himself to handle it during the months of planning and preparation that had led to this moment. "I need you to let it run," Darnell said. And this was the critical instruction, the thing that could not be compromised or negotiated or modified based on someone's discomfort with how it looked or how it felt. Don't make any calls to the district attorney's office. Don't send anyone to intervene. Don't do anything that would alert Harrison or anyone else in Ashford City that this isn't exactly what it appears to be. "Don't make any calls to the DA's office," Evelyn repeated slowly, making sure she understood exactly what Darnell was asking her to do, which was to leave him in custody to let him go through arraignment and potentially through an entire trial without any federal intervention, without any identification of who he really was, without any of the protections that his actual status as a federal prosecutor would normally afford him. "Don't send anyone." "Let it go to arraignment," Darnell said, "and let it go to trial if it gets there, because I need them comfortable. I need Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs and Amanda Cross and everyone else involved in this to believe that this is just another routine arrest. Just another defendant who's going to be processed through the system exactly like all the others, because the moment they think something is different, the moment they suspect that this might be a setup, they'll start destroying evidence and coaching witnesses and building defenses that will make it much harder to convict them when we finally spring the trap." There was another pause, longer this time, and Darnell could almost hear Evelyn Moss thinking through all the scenarios, all the things that could go wrong with this plan, all the ways that leaving a federal prosecutor in custody and potentially sending him to trial on false charges could blow up in their faces and end careers and undermine the entire mission of the Civil Rights Division. "Darnell," she said finally, and her voice had that particular tone that people use when they're about to voice an objection they know won't be accepted, but feel obligated to voice anyway. "That could be." "I know what it could be," Darnell interrupted, gently but firmly, because he'd already thought through all of this, had already considered every possible objection and every possible risk, and had decided that this was the only way to build a case strong enough to survive the inevitable legal challenges, the only way to put Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs and everyone else involved in this corruption on record under oath in a public courtroom where their lies would be documented forever. "Let it run. I need them comfortable. I need a courtroom." Evelyn Moss was quiet for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, and then she said, "You have everything you need. I have everything I've had for 3 years," Darnell replied. And there was something in his voice that communicated absolute certainty, absolute confidence. The voice of someone who had planned for every contingency and prepared for every possible scenario, and was now simply executing a strategy that had been mapped out in exhaustive detail. "I just need a courtroom where all of this becomes part of the public record, where Blake Harrison has to testify under oath, where the video evidence gets entered into the official transcript, where everything becomes undeniable and unavoidable." He hung up the phone and he sat back down on the holding cell bench and he folded his hands in front of him and he waited, because waiting was what the next 3 days required. Waiting for the arraignment, waiting for Blake Harrison to get comfortable, waiting for the trap to close. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when the autumn sun was just starting to break through the clouds that had covered Ashford City for most of the week, Darnell Cooper appeared in Courtroom 9 of the Ashford County Superior Court for his arraignment, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, a navy wool coat and dress pants that were now slightly rumpled from 3 days of being worn in a holding cell, looking tired but composed, looking like someone who understood exactly where he was and exactly what was about to happen next. He had declined the public defender who had been automatically assigned to his case, filing paperwork instead to represent himself pro se, which was Latin for appearing in court without a lawyer representing your own interests, speaking for yourself rather than having someone else speak for you. And the clerk who processed that paperwork had raised an eyebrow but said nothing, because people had the right to represent themselves even when it was obviously a terrible idea. Even when it meant going up against professional prosecutors with years of experience and institutional knowledge that would give them massive advantages. The presiding judge at the arraignment was the Honorable Patricia Morales, 64 years old, 22 years on the bench, known throughout the Ashford County legal community for her impatience with theatrical lawyers who tried to turn routine proceedings into performances, and for her meticulous adherence to procedure and protocol, and all the small rules that kept the machinery of justice moving smoothly even when individual cases threatened to clog up the works. She had seen everything over those 22 years, or believed she had presided over murders and assaults and robberies and every other crime that human beings commit against each other, had heard every excuse and every explanation and every plea for mercy that defendants and their lawyers could come up with, and she'd developed the kind of professional skepticism that comes from realizing that most people who stand before you claiming innocence are lying, and most people who claim they've changed their ways will be back in your courtroom within a year facing new charges. Amanda Cross stood at the prosecution table looking crisp and prepared her files organized in neat stacks. Her notes typed up and printed out, everything color-coded and cross-referenced, because Amanda was nothing if not efficient, nothing if not thorough in her preparation, even for routine proceedings, like arraignments that usually took less than 10 minutes and consisted mainly of reading charges and entering pleas and setting bail. Blake Harrison sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, no longer in his police uniform, but wearing a suit and tie, looking official and professional, and like someone who had every right to be there, still wearing that quiet smirk that suggested he knew exactly how this was going to end and was simply waiting for the formalities to be completed before the inevitable guilty verdict and the inevitable sentence and the inevitable moment when another person he'd targeted disappeared into the prison system. Tony Riggs was beside him, also in civilian clothes, also looking comfortable and confident, scrolling through his phone until a bailiff walked past and gave him a look that communicated very clearly that phones were not supposed to be out during court proceedings, and if he didn't put it away immediately, there would be consequences. Darnell stood at the defense table alone, no lawyer beside him, no files stacked in front of him, no notes or exhibits or any of the usual apparatus that defendants bring to court when they're trying to fight charges, just standing there with his hands clasped in front of him, and that same expression of calm water that gave nothing away, that revealed nothing about what he was thinking or feeling or planning. Judge Morales looked at him over her reading glasses, the kind of look that judges give to defendants who have chosen to represent themselves, a look that combines concern and skepticism and a certain amount of pity for what they're about to experience. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice carrying the particular formality that judges use when they're on the record, when every word is being transcribed by the court reporter and will become part of the permanent legal record you've elected to represent yourself at this proceeding. "Yes, Your Honor," Darnell replied, his voice clear and confident, and showing none of the nervousness that most people feel the first time they stand in front of a judge facing serious criminal charges. "You understand that you have the right to counsel." Judge Morales continued because this was part of the ritual, part of the procedure that had to be followed to make sure that defendants understood they were giving up important protections when they chose to represent themselves. "I do," Darnell said. "And you're waiving that right?" the judge asked, giving him one more chance to change his mind, one more opportunity to request the public defender who had been assigned to him, and who was probably sitting in an office somewhere breathing a sigh of relief that his impossible caseload had just gotten slightly less impossible. "For today's proceeding, yes," Darnell said, and then he added, "Because this was important for what came next, I'll be securing representation before trial." Judge Morales looked at him for a beat longer than was strictly standard, longer than she would normally look at a defendant during a routine arraignment, and there was something in her expression that suggested she was trying to figure out what was different about this case. What detail was nagging at the back of her mind? What about this man standing in front of her didn't quite fit the room's expectations of who should be standing there and how they should be acting? She made a small mental note to herself, the kind of mental note that experienced judges make when something feels slightly off, even if they can't articulate exactly what that something is. And then she moved on because there were 30 other cases on the docket for today, and she couldn't spend all morning trying to decode the subtle wrongness of one defendant's demeanor. The charges were read aloud by the clerk, the formal legal language that transformed Darnell's arrest into official proceedings possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute a felony under Mississippi law carrying a potential sentence of 5 to 20 years, depending on the specific circumstances and the defendant's criminal history and the judge's discretion at sentencing. Darnell entered a plea of not guilty, speaking the words clearly into the record, and Amanda Cross made a note on her legal pad, even though this was completely expected because virtually every defendant pleads not guilty at arraignment, even if they plan to change that plea later as part of a deal with prosecutors. Amanda moved for the bail figure she'd already set $80,000, standing up and addressing the judge with the kind of confidence that came from knowing that her bail recommendations were virtually always accepted, that judges trusted prosecutors to set appropriate amounts based on the seriousness of the charges and the likelihood that the defendant would flee rather than face trial. Darnell did not contest the bail amount, which was odd, because $80,000 was a significant sum, more than most people could raise without selling property or borrowing from family or going through a bail bondsman who would charge a non-refundable premium of 10 or 15%, and most defendants at this point would be scrambling, would be asking for a lower amount, would be arguing that they had ties to the community and weren't a flight risk, and deserved a bail figure that they could actually afford to pay. But Darnell simply set his voice, calm and matter-of-fact, like he was commenting on the weather rather than on a financial demand that would bankrupt most families. "I'll post the full amount by end of business today, Your Honor." And that's when the atmosphere in the courtroom changed, when something shifted in a way that everyone present could feel, even if they couldn't immediately articulate what had changed or why it mattered. Amanda Cross turned to look at him. Really look at him for the first time since this proceeding had started. Her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to reconcile the defendant standing in front of her with the statement he'd just made. Tried to figure out how someone arrested for drug trafficking had $80,000 in cash available to post bail immediately. Judge Morales looked at him, her reading glasses sliding slightly down her nose as she leaned forward, and her expression had shifted from routine professional skepticism to something more alert, more focused, more curious about who this man actually was beneath the surface details of his arrest report. Even the court reporter, a middle-aged woman named Gloria Hendricks, who had worked this courtroom for 15 years and had transcribed thousands of arraignments and had heard every possible statement that defendants could make, looked up from her stenography machine with an expression that suggested this was not a sentence she typed very often. That defendants who could casually produce $80,000 in cash were not the usual clientele of Courtroom 9. Blake Harrison's smirk slipped exactly 1 degree. Just a barely perceptible change in his expression. that someone who wasn't watching closely might have missed entirely. But Darnell was watching closely, was watching for exactly this reaction. This first tiny crack in Blake's certainty. This first small moment of doubt about whether everything was proceeding exactly according to the script he'd written in his mind. In the back row of the gallery, almost invisible among the other spectators who were waiting for their own cases to be called, sat Rosa Tucker, 52 years old, gray hair pulled back in a bun, wearing her church clothes, because she'd learned that judges paid more attention to you when you looked respectable, when you looked like the kind of person who deserved to be taken seriously. Beside her sat her granddaughter Jasmine, 10 years old, small for her age, wearing a dress that was slightly too big because it used to belong to her older cousin, her hair braided with care that morning by Rosa's hands, her eyes wide and taking in everything about this courtroom with the kind of attention that children pay when they understand that something important is happening even if they don't fully understand what it means. Rosa gripped Jasmine's hand tighter when Darnell said he would post the $80,000, gripped it hard enough that Jasmine looked up at her grandmother with a question in her eyes, and Rosa didn't answer because she didn't know what this meant. Yet didn't know why this defendant was different from all the other defendants she'd watched over the past 19 months, didn't know why her heart was suddenly beating faster and her hands were suddenly shaking with something that might have been hope. Except that hope was dangerous. Hope could break you when it turned out to be unfounded. Jasmine, 10 years old with her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn belief that truth mattered, even when the world suggested otherwise, whispered quietly enough that only Rosa could hear Grandma. "Who is that man?" Rosa. Washington didn't answer because she didn't know, not yet, but she would remember later when everything came out, and the whole truth was finally revealed in that explosive moment in courtroom 14 that her granddaughter had been the first person to ask that question. The first person to recognize that something about this man was different, that something about this case didn't fit the pattern they'd become so grimly familiar with. Darnell Cooper paid $80,000 in cash bail by 4:15 that afternoon, walked out of the Ashford County Correctional Facility into the thin October sunlight that seemed brighter than it should have been after 3 days of fluorescent lights, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, straightening his coat, breathing in air that didn't smell like bleach and despair, feeling the weight of what he'd just done and what came next. He called a number on his personal cell phone, a different phone than the one that had been confiscated during his booking because Darnell Cooper carried 2 phones, always one that was his official device, and one that was personal, one that the police had taken, and one that they didn't know existed. And when the call connected, he said simply, "I'm out. Start preparing the filings. We're about 3 weeks from the end." The attorney that Darnell had secured, the one he'd told Judge Morales he would be finding before trial, was a man named Theodore Calloway, though everyone who knew him called him Theo because Theodore was too formal for a man who had spent his entire career fighting against formal injustice with informal weapons like charm and intelligence and a willingness to work longer hours than anyone else in the building. Theo was 69 years old, technically semi-retired, though he would have argued with the semi-part since he was still taking on selective cases that interested him. Still showing up to teach an occasional seminar at the law school, still writing articles for legal journals about criminal procedure and constitutional rights and all the ways that the American justice system failed to live up to its own stated ideals. He was one of the most decorated civil litigation attorneys in the southeastern United States, a fact that was documented not just in the awards hanging on his office walls, but in the nervous reactions of opposing counsel when they found out he was representing the other side in the way that judges paid closer attention, when he spoke in the way that his reputation for meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examination preceded him into every courtroom he entered. He had argued 6 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States over his 4-decade career, a number that put him in extremely rare company, since most lawyers never argue a single case before the highest court in the land, and he had won 4 of those 6 cases, a success rate that was even more remarkable when you considered that the Supreme Court only takes cases where the law is genuinely unclear and reasonable people can disagree about the correct interpretation. His reputation for surgical cross-examination was the stuff of legend among lawyers who practiced in the region, and former opponents described his technique consistently, and with a kind of traumatized reverence, as being like getting autopsied while still alive, like having every weakness in your testimony exposed and examined and held up to the light until there was nothing left but the truth, stark and unavoidable and impossible to deny. Theo had also been Darnell's mentor at Georgetown Law 21 years ago, back when Darnell was a first-year student trying to figure out if he actually belonged in one of the top law schools in the country, or if his admission had been some kind of administrative error that would eventually be discovered and corrected. Theo had been a visiting professor that year teaching a seminar on constitutional criminal procedure, and he'd noticed Darnell immediately had noticed the way the young man asked questions that cut straight to the heart of complex issues, the way he connected dots that other students missed, the way he thought about law, not as an abstract intellectual exercise, but as something that affected real people's real lives in real time. They'd stayed in touch over the years, exchanging emails and occasional phone calls, meeting for lunch when Darnell was in town, and Theo had watched with pride as his former student built a career as a federal prosecutor, as someone who was using his legal education to actually fight for justice rather than just to make money defending corporations. The meeting took place in a rented conference room in a law firm in Atlanta, neutral territory, that wasn't connected to either the Ashford City District Attorney's Office or the Ashford City Police Department, a room that had been swept for listening devices twice before the first meeting, once by the firm's own security contractor, and once by a team from the FBI that Evelyn Moss had dispatched, because when you're building a federal case against corrupt police officers, you cannot be too careful about who might be listening to your preparations. When Theo sat down across from Darnell in that conference room with its generic corporate art on the walls and its pitcher of water sitting untouched on the table between them, and opened the case file that Darnell slid across to him with both hands, like it was something precious and fragile that needed to be handled with extreme care, he was quiet for a long time. Not because he was surprised by what he was reading, because Theo had been practicing law long enough that very little surprised him anymore, but rather because he was reading carefully the way a surgeon reads a CT scan before picking up a scalpel, the way someone who understands that details matter reads something that contains an enormous amount of detail that all has to be perfectly accurate, because one error, one inconsistency, one piece of evidence that doesn't quite fit could be enough to give the defense an opening that would allow guilty people to walk free. The file contained 38 months of documentation, which meant that every day for more than 3 years, someone had been working on this case, gathering evidence, conducting interviews, building connections between disparate pieces of information, until the full picture emerged. It was organized into 7 sections, each one meticulously labeled and cross-referenced, each one containing the kind of detail that made it clear this wasn't some rush job thrown together to meet a deadline, but rather a comprehensive investigation that had been pursued with the kind of methodical thoroughness that federal prosecutors bring to organized crime cases. The kind of cases where you know you only get one chance to make the charges stick, and if you fail, the targets will disappear or die or flee the country. The first section covered the personnel history of Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs, their careers spanning 20 and 7 years respectively with the Ashford City Police Department, their commendation records that showed they'd been recognized multiple times for excellent police work, and their disciplinary history, which was much more interesting because it included 3 complaints that had disappeared before they were formally investigated, vanishing from the record in ways that suggested someone with authority had decided that these complaints were inconvenient and needed to go away. There was also 1 sealed internal affairs file on Blake Harrison, sealed under circumstances that the documentation suggested involved Captain Harold Montgomery, who happened to be Blake's direct supervisor, and who happened to have his own financial irregularities that would become relevant later when the full scope of the corruption was finally revealed. The second section contained surveillance data that had been gathered over months of careful observation, vehicle movements tracked through license plate readers and GPS devices that had been installed with federal warrants, phone records obtained through the same warrants, showing patterns of communication between Blake and Tony and several other individuals whose names would become important as the investigation progressed, and time-stamped photographs that documented meetings and movements and transactions that looked completely innocent when viewed individually, but that formed a clear pattern when assembled together. The third section contained the sworn testimonies of 12 previous defendants, 11 black men and 1 black woman, all of whom had been arrested by Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs on drug charges over a 5-year period, all of whom had maintained their innocence throughout their trials. All of whom had been convicted anyway because juries tend to believe police officers over defendants, especially when those defendants are black and poor and don't have the resources to mount effective defenses. 5 of those 12 defendants had served portions of prison sentences, years of their lives spent in cages for crimes they insisted they didn't commit, years they would never get back, no matter how many exonerations or pardons or apologies were issued later. 3 of the 12 were still incarcerated at the time this file was compiled, still sitting in prison cells, still maintaining their innocence, still waiting for someone to believe them. And one of those 3 was a man named Isaiah Tucker, 38 years old, father of Jasmine, husband of a woman who had died while he was in prison fighting charges he swore were false, serving 19 months of a 5-year sentence for possession with intent to distribute, when the only thing he'd ever distributed was the paychecks from his job as a maintenance worker at a school district that didn't pay enough to cover rent and groceries and still save anything for emergencies. The fourth section was a forensic analysis of the drug evidence chain of custody in 9 cases, including Darnell's own arrest conducted by a federal laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, using techniques that most state crime labs didn't have access to because the equipment was too expensive and the training was too specialized. The analysis had identified something remarkable, a specific batch marker in the cocaine used in 4 different cases separated by 22 months, which meant that the drugs planted in 4 different defendants' vehicles over nearly 2 years had all come from the same source, had all been part of the same original seizure, had all been sitting in the Ashford City Police Department's evidence room waiting to be repurposed into manufactured charges whenever Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs decided they needed another arrest. The fifth section was financial documentation that painted a picture of wealth that didn't match Blake Harrison's salary, that showed a police detective who should have been making maybe $75,000 a year, somehow affording a cabin in Tennessee that cost $300,000, purchasing it through his wife's maiden name to make the ownership slightly harder to trace, paying for his son's tuition at a private academy that charged $30,000 a year, living a lifestyle that was comfortable. More than comfortable, really, in ways that suggested money was coming from somewhere besides his official paycheck. The forensic accountants who compiled this section had traced Blake's Tennessee cabin financing through 6 layers of corporate paperwork, following the money like bloodhounds following a scent, until they finally connected it to a mid-level drug distributor named Vincent Kane, who operated in the Riverside district of Ashford City, who moved cocaine and methamphetamine in quantities large enough to make him a significant target for law enforcement, but small enough that he'd managed to avoid federal attention until Darnell's investigation put him on the radar. The 6th section was the operational record of Darnell's own investigation, including the night of October 19th documented in advance, like a military operation where every detail had been planned and every contingency had been considered. The route Darnell had driven had been deliberately selected to take him through the Riverside district at a time when Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs were known to be on patrol, increasing the odds that they would see him and make the stop. The rental car had been deliberately chosen and rented under Darnell's own name to create a clean paper trail that couldn't be disputed with the rental agreement and the inspection records, all documented and notarized and impossible to challenge. The taillight had been inspected and verified as functional before Darnell departed on his drive, with photographs taken and time-stamped and stored in multiple locations, including cloud servers that couldn't be accessed or tampered with by anyone in Ashford City. And most importantly, Darnell had been wearing a body camera disguised as a lapel pin, a piece of technology so sophisticated that it looked exactly like an ordinary piece of jewelry capturing high-definition video with audio from an angle that had been calculated to show the passenger side of his vehicle to record the entire traffic stop, to document the 4-minute window when Tony Riggs was alone on the passenger side of the Audi, doing things that Blake Harrison would later claim under oath never happened. The 7th section was the federal charges already drafted, already reviewed and approved by 2 senior attorneys at the Department of Justice who understood exactly how important this case was and exactly how carefully everything needed to be documented. Charges that included civil rights violations and evidence tampering and conspiracy and obstruction of justice, all waiting to be filed the moment the state trial concluded and everything had been entered into the public record under oath, where it could never be denied or explained away. Theo closed the file after reading all 7 sections, carefully taking his time making small notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking Darnell to clarify a specific detail or explain how a particular piece of evidence had been obtained, and when he finally looked up from the last page, his expression was thoughtful, measured the expression of someone who was processing what he'd just read and considering all of its implications. "You let them arrest you," Theo said, and it wasn't a question exactly, but rather a statement that needed to be confirmed, a fact that was so remarkable that it needed to be said out loud to be fully understood. "Yes," Darnell replied simply. "You let them put you in a cage for 43 hours. Theo continued, his voice still calm, but with an undercurrent of something else, something that might have been concern or might have been admiration, or might have been both. "You could have identified yourself the moment they approached the car, could have shown them your federal credentials, could have ended the whole thing before it started." "I know," Darnell said. "Why didn't you?" Theo asked, and this was the question that mattered. This was the question that would determine whether what Darnell had done was brilliant or reckless or somewhere in between. Darnell was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands resting on the conference room table. Hands that had been handcuffed 43 hours ago. Hands that still had faint marks on the wrists from where the metal had pressed into skin. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 38 months of preparation and the certainty of someone who had thought this through from every possible angle. "Because 12 people before me didn't have the option I had," he said, slowly, letting each word land with its full weight. "They couldn't identify themselves as federal officers and make the problem go away. They couldn't pull out credentials that would make Blake Harrison suddenly remember he had somewhere else to be. They just went to jail. They just got processed through the system. They just got convicted and sentenced and sent to prison for crimes they didn't commit, while people like Amanda Cross looked at the evidence Blake Harrison provided and never asked the questions that needed to be asked." He paused, took a breath, continued. "So, I needed to understand completely personally, in my body, and not just in my head, what they experienced," Darnell said. "I needed to know what it felt like to sit in that holding cell and know you're innocent, but also know that innocence doesn't matter as much as the badge and the testimony and the systematic assumptions that juries make about who deserves to be believed. And I needed a courtroom where everything these men have done would be put on record under oath in public, not in some sealed federal filing that gets buried in a courthouse basement, but in public where every person in Ashford City can see it, where the local media can report on it, where it becomes part of the permanent record that can't be disappeared, the way those internal affairs complaints got disappeared." Theo was quiet for a long moment, and at 69 years old, he had seen moral courage before in his 4 decades of practice, had argued for it, and defended it, and built cases around it, had represented people who had stood up against powerful institutions and suffered consequences for their courage. But this was different, and Theo recognized immediately that this was different, because this was a man who had chosen to experience injustice when he could have observed it from a position of safety, who had chosen to put himself in a cage, so he could understand the dimensions of that cage from the inside rather than measuring it from the outside, who had subjected himself to the same dehumanizing process that all of Blake Harrison's other victims had experienced, because he understood that understanding something in your body is fundamentally different from understanding it in your head. Darnell Theo said finally, and his voice had that particular gentleness that mentors use when they recognize that their student has surpassed them in the only way that really matters when they see someone doing something braver and more principled than they themselves would have had the courage to do. I taught you constitutional law at Georgetown. I taught you civil procedure and criminal procedure and evidence and all the technical aspects of how the legal system is supposed to work. But I didn't teach you this. My father taught me this, Darnell said, and there was something in his voice that suggested this was a truth he'd been carrying for a long time, something fundamental about who he was and why he'd chosen to do this work in this particular way. Before the third job put him in an early grave at 53 before he worked himself to death trying to give our family the kind of life that shouldn't require 3 jobs to achieve. He taught me that understanding something in your body is different from understanding it in your head. That there's a kind of knowledge that only comes from lived experience, that you can't really know what it's like to be trapped until you've been trapped yourself, can't really understand what injustice feels like until you felt it pressing against your chest like a weight that makes it hard to breathe. Darnell's eyes met Theo's across the conference table. He taught me that this kind of knowledge, this embodied knowledge, is what makes testimony real in a way that abstract arguments never can be. Darnell continued, that's what makes a jury listen, what makes a judge pay attention. What makes the difference between a case that gets dismissed as theoretical complaints about police procedure and a case that forces everyone in the courtroom to confront the reality of what's being done to actual human beings, with actual lives and actual families who are being destroyed by people who think their badges make them untouchable. Theo opened the file again, but this time his hands were steadier, more certain the hands of someone who had just understood that this case wasn't just another case, wasn't just another fight against injustice, but rather something that had the potential to change the way people thought about police accountability, that had the potential to create precedents that would matter for decades. Tell me when you want to start, Theo said. The trial of the state of Mississippi versus Darnell Cooper began on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 4 weeks after the arrest that had started this whole machinery of justice grinding forward 4 weeks, during which Darnell had been free on bail, and Blake Harrison had been growing increasingly comfortable with the idea that this case would end the way all his other cases had ended, with a conviction, a sentence, and another person disappearing into the prison system while Blake collected another commendation for taking drugs off the streets. Courtroom 14 of the Ashford County Superior Court was larger than Courtroom 9, where the arraignment had taken place, a space designed to hold approximately 95 spectators in its gallery, with wooden benches that had been worn smooth by decades of people sitting on them waiting for their own cases to be called, or watching other people's fates being decided by judges and juries. On the day the trial opened, 91 of those 95 seats were filled, which was highly unusual for a drug possession case, the kind of case that normally attracted maybe a dozen spectators at most. Usually family members of the defendant and a few courthouse regulars who had nothing better to do than watch the machinery of justice process another human being through its gears. But word had gotten around Ashford City over the past 4 weeks, not about who Darnell Cooper really was, because that information was still locked down tight, still classified at a level that required federal clearance to access, but rather about the fact that this defendant had paid $80,000 in cash bail without even blinking, that he'd walked into his arraignment without a lawyer and seemed completely untroubled by this fact, and that the attorney now sitting beside him was Theodore Calloway, whose face had been on the cover of Georgia Legal Review 3 times, and whose reputation for destroying witnesses on cross-examination had made him something of a legend among people who paid attention to such things. Blake Harrison was in the gallery, seated 4 rows back from the prosecution table, no longer in his police uniform, but wearing a charcoal gray suit with a blue tie, looking official and professional. and like someone who had every right to be there. Like someone whose presence in that courtroom was a testament to his dedication to public service, rather than evidence of his complicity in the charges being prosecuted. His platinum blonde crew cut was fresh cut within the past day or two, and his jaw was set with that same arrogance that had been there during the traffic stop. Though if you looked closely, you might have noticed that the smirk was less pronounced than it had been a month ago, that there was something in his eyes that suggested he was watching Darnell and Theo with the quiet attention of a man who had begun to wonder just barely, just at the edges of his consciousness, if something about this case was slightly off from the script he'd written in his mind. Tony Riggs was not in the gallery, a fact that might have seemed significant if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice his absence, but most people weren't paying that kind of attention because Tony had called in sick that morning. Told the desk sergeant he had a stomach bug, said he'd be back in a day or two once whatever he'd eaten had worked its way out of his system, and the desk sergeant had not asked follow-up questions because police officers calling in sick was routine, unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened every day and didn't warrant any particular scrutiny. Judge Patricia Morales presided from the bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her expression set in that neutral professional mask that judges wear when they're about to preside over a trial that could last days or weeks, and they need to conserve their emotional energy for the moments when it really matters. Amanda Cross sat at the prosecution table with her files arranged in perfect stacks, color-coded tabs marking different sections of evidence and witness lists and legal precedents. Her blonde hair pulled back in that same tight bun that suggested she viewed her own appearance as just another form of evidence that needed to be presented precisely and without any room for misinterpretation. Theo Calloway sat at the defense table beside Darnell, 70 years of accumulated legal knowledge contained in a body that looked frailer than it actually was, wearing a suit that had been expensive 20 years ago and was now simply well-maintained, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having argued before the Supreme Court and won more often than you lost. The gallery was filled with a cross-section of Ashford City that told its own story about who cared about justice and who had been affected by the corruption that was about to be exposed. There were 3 local journalists, notebooks open and pens ready, sensing that this case might be more interesting than the usual drug possession trial. There were 2 legal observers from the State Public Defender's Office, watching to see how Theo Calloway worked his magic so they could learn techniques they might use in their own impossible caseloads. And there were ordinary citizens who had heard something was different about this case and wanted to see for themselves what that difference might be. In the back row, almost invisible among the other spectators, sat Rosa Tucker with her granddaughter Jasmine, both of them dressed in their church clothes because Rosa had learned over 19 months of attending court proceedings that judges and juries paid more attention to you when you looked respectable, when you looked like the kind of person who deserved to be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as just another poor black woman with a son in prison claiming he was innocent, when everybody knew that people who got arrested for drugs were usually guilty. Rosa held Jasmine's hand tightly, her grip communicating both protection and anxiety. Both the desire to shield her granddaughter from the harsh realities of what happened in courtrooms and the need to teach her that sometimes you had to witness injustice in order to fight against it. That sometimes the only way to change a broken system was to show up day after day and refuse to look away, no matter how much it hurt. Jasmine sat very still, her 10-year-old body compressed into the smallest possible space, her eyes taking in everything about this courtroom with an intensity that suggested she understood even at her age that something important was happening here, that this trial was connected somehow to her father sitting in a prison cell 90 miles away, that the man at the defense table might hold some key to a door that had been locked for 19 months. Court reporter Gloria Hendricks sat at her stenography machine, fingers poised and ready, watching the proceedings with the practiced eye of someone who had transcribed thousands of trials and had learned to recognize when something was about to happen that would make this one worth remembering. Judge Morales called the court to order the bailiff announce the case, and Amanda Cross stood to give her opening statement, walking to the podium with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this dozens of times before and knew exactly how to structure a narrative that would lead a jury from initial skepticism to final conviction. She laid out the prosecution's case with surgical precision, each sentence building on the one before it, constructing a story that seemed simple and straightforward and inevitable. The traffic stop that began when Blake Harrison observed a broken taillight. The lawful search of the vehicle that followed the discovery of 45.7 grams of cocaine in the glove compartment. The arrest that was not just justified but required by law. The chain of custody that documented every movement of that evidence from the moment it was seized to the moment it was analyzed in the state crime lab, and the lab analysis that confirmed beyond any doubt that this was cocaine hydrochloride in quantities that clearly indicated intent to distribute rather than personal use. The evidence was straightforward, Amanda told the jury, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed what she was saying because she had never been given any reason to doubt it. The defendant was caught with a significant quantity of illegal drugs. The chain of custody was clean. The science was clear. This was not a complicated case, she said, not a case that required the jury to make difficult judgments about ambiguous evidence or competing narratives, just a case where the facts spoke for themselves, and the facts said that the defendant was guilty of the charges and deserved to be held accountable for his choices. She called her first witness, Officer Lance Edwards, the young man who had processed Darnell's booking on the night of his arrest. And Lance walked to the witness stand with the nervous energy of someone who had testified before but never quite got comfortable with it, never quite stopped feeling like everyone in the room was judging him, even though he was just there to state facts about procedure. Lance testified about the booking procedure with mechanical precision, describing how Darnell had been photographed and fingerprinted, how his personal effects had been cataloged and stored, how everything had been done exactly according to department protocol with no deviations and no irregularities. Amanda walked him through the testimony, efficiently establishing that the arrest had been processed correctly, that all the paperwork had been filed properly, that there was nothing about the administrative handling of this case that could be questioned or attacked. Theo's cross-examination of Lance Edwards was brief, almost bored, just a few questions to establish that Lance himself had not been present at the traffic stop, had not witnessed the arrest, had no personal knowledge of anything that had happened on Brennan Avenue at 11:38 p.m. on October 19th, except what Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs had told him when they brought Darnell into the station. Amanda called her second witness, Dr. Martin Kemp, the forensic chemist from the state crime lab who had analyzed the substance seized from Darnell's vehicle, and Dr. Kemp was the kind of expert witness that prosecutors loved. Credentialed, experienced, confident, capable of explaining complex scientific concepts in language that juries could understand without talking down to them or making them feel stupid. Dr. Kemp testified that he had received the evidence on October 21st, 2 days after the arrest, that he had analyzed it using standard testing protocols, that he had confirmed the substance was cocaine hydrochloride with a purity of approximately 92%, and that the total weight was 45.7 grams, well above the threshold for intent to distribute under Mississippi law. Amanda asked him about the batch analysis methodology, about how forensic chemists could sometimes identify markers that indicated different samples came from the same source, and Dr. Kemp explained the process in technical detail that made 2 of the jurors lean forward with sudden interest, while the other 10 looked like they were trying very hard to stay awake and follow along. Theo's cross-examination of Dr. Kemp was longer than his cross of Lance Edwards, more technical, more focused on the specific details of how the batch analysis had been conducted, what markers had been identified, what the margin of error was in determining whether 2 samples came from the same source, and Dr. Kemp answered each question carefully, professionally, giving the kind of detailed technical responses that confused Amanda, because she couldn't figure out where Theo was going with this line of questioning, couldn't see the trap that was being laid, because the trap was subtle and wouldn't become obvious until much later. The questioning seemed to bore the jury, or at least 10 of the 12 jurors who had stopped taking notes and were now just sitting there waiting for this technical discussion to be over so they could get back to the more straightforward narrative of guilt and punishment. But 2 jurors, a woman in her 50s who worked as a high school chemistry teacher and a man in his 30s who had studied engineering before switching to accounting, were watching Theo's cross-examination with sharper attention than they'd shown for anything else so far, taking careful notes following the technical discussion in a way that suggested they understood that something important was being established here, even if that importance wasn't immediately obvious. The first day ended as the sun was starting to set outside the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom that made everyone look slightly unreal, slightly theatrical, like actors playing roles in a drama whose final act hadn't been written yet. The gallery emptied in controlled chaos, 100 people all trying to make phone calls at the same time. Journalists calling their editors legal observers, calling their offices ordinary citizens, calling friends and family to report on what they'd seen. Rosa Tucker holding Jasmine's hand and guiding her through the crowd toward the exit without saying much, because there wasn't much to say yet, not until they saw what would happen tomorrow. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Blake Harrison found Amanda Cross approached her with that careful casualness that people use when they're trying to ask a question without appearing worried, trying to get information without revealing that they need reassurance. "What is Calloway doing?" Blake asked, his voice low enough that the people walking past couldn't hear, but loud enough that Amanda could hear the edge in it, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into someone who had been absolutely certain just a few hours ago. "His job," Amanda replied with the slight irritation of someone who didn't enjoy being questioned by witnesses who considered herself the professional in this relationship and expected police officers to trust her judgment about trial strategy. "He's trying to create doubt where there isn't any. It's what defense attorneys do. Slow down. Don't get paranoid." "I'm not paranoid," Blake started to say, but Amanda cut him off. "You'll take the stand tomorrow," she said firmly, using the voice she used when she needed witnesses to listen to her instructions without questioning them. "Tell the same story you've told 9 times before in 9 other trials. It always works. The jury believes cops. They especially believe cops who look like you and sound like you and have 20 years of commendations. Just stick to the script and this will be over by the end of the week." Blake nodded, but as he walked toward the elevator and the doors closed behind him, the smirk that had been his constant companion for the past 4 weeks was gone entirely, replaced by an expression that suggested he was running through scenarios in his mind, calculating possibilities, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he should have asked more questions about who Darnell Cooper actually was before assuming this would be just another easy conviction. Blake Harrison took the witness stand on the morning of the second day of trial, raising his right hand and swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, speaking the words with the practiced ease of someone who had testified dozens of times before and never had any reason to worry that his version of events would be questioned by anyone who mattered. He was wearing the same charcoal suit he'd worn the day before, but this time he'd added an American flag pin to his lapel. A small detail that prosecutors like Amanda Cross loved, because it sent a subtle message to juries about patriotism and service, and the idea that police officers were the good guys, the protectors, the thin blue line standing between civilization and chaos. Amanda walked him through his testimony with practiced smoothness, asking questions that she'd carefully scripted in advance, questions designed to let Blake tell his story in a way that seemed natural and unrehearsed, even though every word had been rehearsed multiple times in Amanda's office over the past week. She asked him about the traffic stop, and Blake described it in detail. He'd been on patrol in the Riverside district on the evening of October 19th. Routine patrol. Nothing unusual when at approximately 11:38 p.m. he'd observed a black Audi A8 with a broken left rear taillight traveling north on Brennan Avenue. The broken taillight was a traffic violation, Blake explained to the jury, his voice confident and matter-of-fact. the voice of someone stating obvious facts that no reasonable person could dispute. Traffic violations gave police officers the authority to conduct stops for safety reasons to make sure vehicles on the road were properly maintained to prevent accidents that could injure or kill innocent people. He'd initiated the stop. He said pulling his cruiser behind the Audi and activating his lights, and the driver, the defendant sitting right there at the defense table, had pulled over immediately and complied with all his instructions, which Blake mentioned specifically because it would make him seem fair and reasonable, willing to acknowledge when suspects behaved appropriately. Amanda asked about the pat-down, and Blake explained that he'd conducted a pat-down of the defendant for officer safety, which was standard procedure during traffic stops. Just a precautionary measure to make sure the person wasn't carrying weapons that could be used to harm the officers. While he was conducting the pat-down, Blake testified his partner, Detective Riggs, had been securing the perimeter, maintaining visual contact with the vehicle, making sure nobody approached from other directions. Standard partner protocol for traffic stops that every police officer in the country would recognize as proper procedure. And then Blake said, and here his voice took on a tone of surprise that he'd been practicing for years, a tone that suggested genuine shock, even though nothing about this situation had been surprising to him. He'd walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle to conduct a visual inspection as part of the stop, and when he'd opened the passenger door and looked inside, he'd seen, in plain view in the glove compartment, a clear plastic bag containing what appeared to be a significant quantity of white powder. Amanda asked him what he did next, and Blake described how he'd conducted a field test of the substance, how the test had come back positive for cocaine, how he'd then placed the defendant under arrest and transported him to the station for booking, how everything had been done by the book. According to procedure, exactly the way police officers were trained to handle situations like this. Blake was good on the witness stand. Very good, honed by 20 years of experience and 5 commendations and dozens of previous trials where his testimony had been accepted without serious challenge. He had the easy authority of a man who was accustomed to being believed, who understood that juries generally trusted police officers, and especially trusted police officers who looked professional and spoke confidently and had decades of service to point to as evidence of their credibility. The jury watched him the way juries watch cops, with a baseline of deference that prosecutors understood and counted on, with the assumption that people who chose careers in law enforcement were fundamentally good people who were trying to do the right thing, that they might make mistakes occasionally, but those mistakes were honest errors rather than deliberate corruption. In the gallery, Jasmine Tucker leaned forward slightly, her small hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench, watching the man who her grandmother had told her was connected somehow to her father's imprisonment, though Rosa had been careful not to explain exactly how, because explaining would have required admitting things that were too painful to speak out loud. Rosa's hand found Jasmine's shoulder, steadying her, but Rosa's own jaw was tight as she listened to Blake Harrison's smooth, confident testimony, listening to him describe procedures and protocols and everything being done by the book, and she wanted to stand up and scream that this man was lying, that everything he was saying was a performance, that her son Isaiah had told the same story about planted evidence and nobody had believed him. And now here was another man with the same story, and would anyone believe him? Or would the machinery just grind forward the way it always did? Amanda finished her direct examination with a flourish, asking Blake if he had any doubt about what he'd seen in the defendant's glove compartment, and Blake said, no doubt at all. The evidence was clear, and his observation was reliable, and he'd done his job exactly the way he'd been trained to do it. No further questions, Amanda said, returning to her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd just sealed the case, that the jury had heard from a credible witness with decades of experience, and there was no way the defense could shake that testimony enough to create reasonable doubt. And then Theodore Calloway stood up, and the entire atmosphere in the courtroom changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, like the pressure drop before a storm. Like that moment when you realize that something you thought was solid is actually balanced on the edge of collapse. Theo stood slowly, the way older men stand when they're conserving energy for something that matters, when they know that the next hour or two will require absolute focus and precision, and they don't want to waste a single movement or word or gesture that doesn't serve the larger purpose. He walked to the podium with measured steps, carrying a single sheet of paper in his hand, and he set that paper down on the podium's surface with a care that suggested it was important that whatever was written on that sheet would matter in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He looked at Blake Harrison for a long moment without speaking, and this silence was deliberate, a technique that experienced cross-examiners use to let the witness wonder what's coming, to let the tension build in the room, to let the jury's attention sharpen, because something about the quality of this silence suggested that what came next would be worth paying attention to. Detective Harrison Theo said finally, and his voice was calm and measured, and contained none of the aggression that some lawyers bring to cross-examination. None of the theatrical anger or confrontation. Just a simple statement of the witness's name and rank. You testified that you observed a broken taillight on my client's vehicle at approximately 11:38 p.m. on October 19th, is that correct? That's correct. Blake replied, his voice still confident, still carrying that easy authority. Though if you were watching very closely, you might have noticed the smallest tightening around his eyes, the tiniest shift in his posture that suggested his body was preparing for something, even if his conscious mind hadn't quite identified what that something might be. And that broken taillight was the basis for the traffic stop, Theo asked, though he already knew the answer because Blake had just testified to exactly this fact during Amanda's direct examination. Yes, Blake said. The broken taillight was your legal justification for pulling my client over for initiating this entire encounter that ultimately led to his arrest. Theo pressed, making absolutely sure this point was established clearly for the record. Yes, Blake repeated. Theo picked up the sheet of paper from the podium, held it for a moment so the jury could see that he was looking at something official, something documented, and then he said, Your Honor, I'm going to enter into evidence what has been marked as Defense Exhibit A. He walked the document to the clerk who took it and stamped it with the court seal, and then the clerk handed it to the judge for her review, and Judge Morales looked at it for a moment before nodding and passing it back to the clerk to be entered into the official record. Amanda was already on her feet, moving quickly because she could feel that something was happening here. Something she hadn't anticipated, and lawyers hate being surprised in court more than almost anything else. Objection, Your Honor. Foundation. The defense hasn't established the authenticity of this document or its relevance to the current testimony. Theo didn't seem bothered by the objection, didn't even turn to look at Amanda. Just kept his eyes on the judge and said in that same calm, measured voice, Your Honor, the exhibit includes the signature of a certified mechanic employed by Summit Auto Rentals, Daniel Green, along with a notarized statement confirming that this document is an accurate representation of the vehicle inspection conducted on October 19th at 3:42 p.m., approximately 8 hours before the traffic stop. Foundation is established and relevance will be immediately apparent. Judge Morales looked at the document again more carefully, this time reading through the details of the inspection report, noting the timestamp and the mechanic's signature and the notarization, and then she looked up and said, Overruled. The document is admitted into evidence. Theo turned back to Blake, and now there was something different in his expression. Something that suggested the preliminaries were over, and the real work was about to begin. Detective Harrison Theo said, I've just entered into evidence a certified maintenance and inspection record from Summit Auto Rentals in Ashford City, dated October 19th at 3:42 p.m., approximately 8 hours before you initiated the traffic stop. This document, signed by certified mechanic Daniel Green and bearing a notarized stamp, confirms that the vehicle rented by my client was inspected prior to his taking possession of it, and that all external lights, including both rear taillights, were in full working order at the time of that inspection. He paused. Let that information settle in the room. Let the jury absorb what he'd just said, and then he asked, in light of this inspection record, Detective Harrison, Can you explain how the left rear tail light came to be broken in the 8 hours between the inspection and your traffic stop? Blake's jaw tightened, and this time the tightening was visible enough that several jurors noticed. It noticed the way his whole face seemed to close down slightly, the way his eyes went from confident to calculating in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Lights can break between an inspection and an encounter, Blake said, and his voice was still controlled, but some of the easy confidence had leaked out of it, replaced by something more defensive. It happens all the time. People hit potholes, debris on the road, can crack a light housing. It's not unusual at all. 8 hours? Theo asked, letting a note of skepticism creep into his voice for the first time. Yes, Blake said. On a rental car that was parked in a lot for most of those 8 hours, Theo pressed. It could have happened during the period when the car was being driven, Blake said, but now he was the one elaborating, the one explaining, the one on the defensive, and experienced trial lawyers know that witnesses on the defensive make mistakes, say things they shouldn't say, create openings for further attack. It happens, Blake concluded, trying to regain some of his earlier confidence. Theo nodded slowly as if considering this explanation, and then he set down the inspection report and moved to his next point, transitioning so smoothly that it took the jury a moment to realize they were moving to different territory. Detective Harrison, Theo said, during the stop, you conducted a pat-down of my client, is that correct? For officer safety, yes, Blake said, and you could hear the relief in his voice that they'd moved past the taillight question, that he'd survived that line of attack without admitting anything damaging. And during that pat-down, your partner, Detective Riggs, was positioned on the passenger side of the vehicle, Theo asked. He was securing the perimeter, Blake said, using the same language he'd used during Amanda's direct examination. He was alone on the passenger side of my client's vehicle for approximately 4 minutes. Is that accurate? Theo asked. He was doing his job, Blake said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he knew where this was going, that his earlier relief had been premature, that the taillight question had just been the setup for something much more dangerous. Detective Harrison was Detective Riggs alone on the passenger side of the vehicle, yes or no? Theo pressed. He was securing the perimeter while I conducted the pat-down. Blake repeated, not quite answering the question directly. Theo reached down and picked up a tablet computer from the defense table, the kind that prosecutors and defense attorneys increasingly used in modern trials instead of paper documents, and he touched the screen a few times, pulling up a file, and then he looked at Judge Morales and said, Your Honor, I'd like to display a video recording that has been marked as Defense Exhibit B. And that's when Amanda Cross moved faster than she'd moved all trial, nearly knocking her chair over as she stood up, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, an edge that came from realizing that something very bad was about to happen, and she had no idea what it was, because Theo had somehow managed to surprise her despite her years of experience and her meticulous preparation. Objection, Amanda said loud enough that several jurors startled. Your Honor, the defense has not previously disclosed this video evidence. We have received no notice that any video recording existed, and this ambush tactic is completely improper and prejudicial to the prosecution's case. Theo turned to look at Amanda for the first time since his cross-examination had begun, and his expression was completely neutral, completely professional, showing no triumph or satisfaction or any emotion at all, just a lawyer stating facts. Your Honor, Theo said, the defense filed an updated exhibit list with the court at 9:15 this morning, well before the start of today's proceedings. That filing, which was served on the prosecution via the court's electronic filing system, clearly lists Defense Exhibit B as an audio-visual recording of the traffic stop event. The prosecution received that filing more than 2 hours ago. Judge Morales looked at Amanda with an expression that contained a question, and Amanda's face had gone slightly pale as she realized that, yes, she had received a filing that morning, had seen it come through on her phone while she was reviewing her notes for Blake's testimony, had glanced at it quickly, and filed it away to read later because she'd been focused on the direct examination and hadn't thought there could be anything truly important in a last-minute filing. Counsel Judge Morales said to Amanda, "Did you receive the exhibit list this morning?" Amanda's composure, which had been rock solid for the entire trial up to this point, flickered for the first time, showing the person underneath the professional mask, showing someone who had just realized that she'd made a mistake and that this mistake was about to have consequences. "I received it, Your Honor," Amanda said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone who appeared to be experiencing the slow-motion collapse of everything she thought she understood about this case. "But I haven't had the opportunity to review the video evidence, or to assess its authenticity, or to—" "The exhibit is admissible," Judge Morales said, cutting through Amanda's objection with the kind of decisive ruling that experienced judges make when they can see that procedural requirements have been met, and further argument is just delay. "Proceed, Mr. Calloway." The courtroom's display screen, a large flat panel that had been installed 2 years ago as part of a courthouse modernization program, lit up with crystal clarity, showing a timestamp in the corner, and a camera angle that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had seen body camera footage before that slightly fisheye distorted view that came from wide-angle lenses mounted on a person's chest. The footage was remarkably clear, much clearer than most body camera video that got played in courtrooms, because the camera hidden in Darnell's lapel pin had been designed by federal engineers who understood that evidence needed to be incontrovertible, needed to be so clear that no one could claim they couldn't see what was happening or couldn't tell who was doing what. The angle was from Darnell's chest, pointed slightly downward, and to the right, showing the passenger window of the Audi and the area immediately around the passenger side of the vehicle, and the timestamp in the corner read 23:41:12, which translated to 11:41 p.m. and 12 seconds on October 19th. The video ran for 4 minutes and 18 seconds. And in that time, the courtroom was completely silent, except for the audio from the recording, which captured the ambient sounds of the traffic stop, the distant hum of traffic on nearby streets, the rustling of Blake Harrison's movements as he conducted the pat-down on the driver's side of the vehicle, and most importantly, the clear visual documentation of everything that happened on the passenger side. For the first 2 minutes and 20 seconds, the video showed Tony Riggs moving around the passenger side of the vehicle, appearing to be doing exactly what Blake had described, securing the perimeter, maintaining visual contact with the car, following standard police procedure for traffic stops. But at timestamp 23:43:32, 2 minutes and 20 seconds into the recording, Tony Riggs leaned into the passenger window of the Audi, and his hand moved toward the glove compartment with a casualness that suggested this was not the first time he'd made this exact motion, that this was practiced, rehearsed muscle memory from having done this enough times that it no longer required conscious thought. The camera captured his hand, reaching for the glove compartment, captured it, opening, captured his hand disappearing inside the compartment for approximately 3 seconds. Captured his hand, withdrawing. Empty. Captured the glove compartment. Closing, all of it documented with a clarity that made interpretation unnecessary, that made denial impossible. That showed exactly what had happened in a way that no amount of clever lawyering could explain away. At timestamp 23:43:58, 26 seconds after Tony Riggs had closed the glove compartment, Blake Harrison walked around to the passenger side of the vehicle, and the camera captured him, opening the passenger door with that same theatrical deliberateness he'd displayed during the actual stop. Captured him leaning into the vehicle, captured him straightening up with his face turning partially toward the camera that he didn't know existed, captured an expression that was trying very hard to look like surprise, but that instead looked exactly like what it was, which was a performance that had been given so many times that the actor had stopped worrying about making it convincing. The courtroom was completely silent as the video played, 91 people watching a screen and barely breathing, watching something that would change everything they thought they understood about this case, about Blake Harrison, about the Ashford City Police Department, about how justice actually worked in their city. Somewhere in the gallery, A woman inhaled sharply, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife, and then everyone was holding their breath again, watching the final seconds of the video, watching Blake Harrison's face on the screen as he pretended to discover drugs that his partner had planted less than a minute earlier. Blake Harrison on the witness stand had gone the color of old paper, that grayish-white shade that people turn when all the blood drains from their face, when their body realizes before their mind does that something catastrophic has just happened, that everything they thought was solid ground underneath their feet has just turned out to be a thin shell over an abyss. In the gallery, Jasmine Tucker's small hand moved to cover her mouth, and her eyes were wide with understanding that she was too young to fully process, but old enough to recognize understanding that she was watching the truth of how they did it, watching the mechanical process by which her father had been sent to prison, watching the casual corruption that had stolen 19 months of her childhood with her father. That was how they did it, she whispered to her grandmother so quietly that only Rosa could hear. That was how they took Daddy. Rosa Washington's hand found Jasmine's shoulder, gripping it with a strength that was both steadying and desperate, and Rosa's own eyes were fixed on the screen with an expression that contained 19 months of being told she was wrong. 19 months of being told that the evidence doesn't lie. 19 months of being told that her son must have done something to deserve his conviction. 19 months of doubt being crushed under the weight of systematic assumptions about who deserved to be believed and who deserved to be dismissed. The evidence didn't lie. She realized her throat tightening with emotions that were too large to name, too complicated to separate into simple categories like anger or relief or vindication. The evidence had been planted, but it didn't lie about that fact, not when you had a camera that captured the planting. Not when you had documentation that showed exactly how the corruption worked. The video ended. The screen going black, and the silence in the courtroom somehow became even deeper. Became the kind of silence that exists in the moment after an earthquake when everything has stopped moving. But nothing is the same as it was when the world is still recognizing that the ground beneath it has fundamentally shifted. Theo Calloway's voice, when he finally spoke, was completely calm, almost unnervingly calm. The voice of someone who had known exactly what that video would show, and exactly what impact it would have, who had been waiting for this moment for weeks, and was now simply executing the final steps of a plan that had been meticulously designed. Detective Harrison, Theo said, and the room was so quiet that his voice seemed to fill every corner of the space, seemed to reach into places where sound didn't normally penetrate. Can you identify the man placing an object in my client's glove compartment at timestamp 23, 43, 32? Blake Harrison said nothing, just sat there on the witness stand with his face the color of old paper and his hands gripping the armrests of the witness chair like he was afraid he might fall if he let go. For the record, Detective Theo continued, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge of steel underneath. The calm is that your partner, Detective Tony Riggs at timestamp 23, 4332, reaching into the glove compartment of my client's vehicle and placing what appears to be a bag of cocaine inside that compartment. The silence stretched, pulled taut like a wire that was about to snap, and Blake Harrison looked at his lawyer, looked at Amanda Cross with an expression that pleaded for rescue, for intervention, for someone to make this stop. But Amanda was staring at the frozen frame on the display screen at Tony Riggs's hand, captured in perfect clarity at the edge of the glove compartment, and her face showed someone who had just realized that the building she thought she was standing in was not the building she'd thought it was, that the foundation had been rotten all along, and she'd been too focused on winning to notice. "I want a lawyer, Blake," Harrison said, finally, and his voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. All of its easy authority had been reduced to something small and frightened and desperate. And with those 4 words, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Patricia Morales needed her gavel 3 times before the noise in courtroom 14 subsided to a level where she could speak and be heard 3 sharp cracks of wood against wood that cut through the sudden explosion of voices and movement. 3 sounds that restored enough order that proceedings could continue, even though everyone in the room understood that nothing about these proceedings would be the same after what they'd just witnessed. When the courtroom had finally quieted to something approximating professional decorum, though the undercurrent of shock and disbelief still hummed through the space like electricity through power lines. Judge Morales looked at Amanda Cross with an expression that contained multitudes, confusion, and professional discomfort and alarm, and something that was rapidly becoming anger at having presided over a trial that was apparently built on manufactured evidence, at having allowed her courtroom to be used as a stage for corruption that she should have caught, but hadn't. "Counsel," she said to Amanda, and her voice carried the particular formality that judges use when they're trying very hard to maintain professional composure in situations that threaten to overwhelm that composure. "Do you want a recess?" Amanda Cross was standing at her table, had stood up at some point during the video without fully realizing she was standing, and she was looking at the frozen frame still displayed on the screen. Tony Riggs's hand at the edge of the glove compartment. The image burned into her retina in a way that suggested she would be seeing it in her mind for years to come. Would be waking up from nightmares about this moment when everything she thought she understood about her job turned out to be wrong. She had built her entire career on the assumption that police officers were fundamentally honest, that the evidence they provided was fundamentally reliable, that her job was to take what they gave her and present it to juries in the most compelling way possible, that winning cases was the same thing as serving justice. Because the police caught the guilty people and the prosecutors convicted them, and the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. And now she was standing in a courtroom looking at video evidence that proved with a clarity that admitted no ambiguity and no alternative interpretation that at least one police officer, and probably more than one, had been manufacturing evidence-planting drugs, destroying lives for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with statistics and promotions and the particular kind of power that came from wearing a badge in a city that didn't ask enough questions. "Your Honor," Amanda said, and her voice was remarkably steady for someone who appeared to be experiencing the real-time collapse of her professional identity. Someone who was watching the foundation of her career crack apart like ice in spring. "Yes. The people request a 30-minute recess." 30 minutes, Judge Morales said, and she struck her gavel once more, the sound echoing in a room that was still processing what it had just seen. "This court is in recess." She stood, and before she walked to her chambers, before she disappeared through the door that led to her private office, where she could sit down and try to understand what had just happened in her courtroom, she looked at Darnell Cooper for the second time since this trial had begun. The first time had been during arraignment when he'd said he would post $80,000 cash bail, and she'd noticed something about him that didn't quite fit her expectations. Something in his composure that suggested depths she couldn't measure. This look was longer, more searching, more focused, and what she saw was that same still water, that same composed face that gave nothing away, that same expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. Something in Judge Morales's expression shifted, though she said nothing. Just looked at Darnell Cooper for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. And then she turned and walked to her chambers and closed the door behind her. The gallery emptied in controlled chaos, 91 people all trying to make phone calls at the same time, trying to text friends and family, trying to process what they'd just witnessed and figure out what it meant and what would happen next. Journalists were already typing on their phones, filing preliminary stories with headlines like "Video Shows," "Detective Planting Evidence in Drug Case," and "Ashford. PD corruption exposed in dramatic court testimony." Legal observers were calling their supervisors, reporting that something unprecedented was happening in courtroom 14, that they needed to pay attention to this case because it was going to change things. Ordinary citizens were calling anyone who would listen, telling them that they'd just watched a cop get caught on camera planting evidence that everything they'd suspected about the Ashford City Police Department had just been proven true in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. Theo Calloway leaned toward Darnell at the defense table, speaking quietly enough that no one else could hear over the chaos of the gallery emptying, and said simply, "Ready?" Darnell looked at his mentor, at the man who had taught him constitutional law 21 years ago, and who had agreed to defend him in this trial, even though both of them knew that the defense was just theater. Just the mechanism by which the truth would be revealed in the most public and undeniable way possible. And he said, "Almost." During the recess, two things happened simultaneously. Two parallel tracks of consequences unfolding in different parts of the courthouse, both of them set in motion by 4 minutes and 18 seconds of video that had just destroyed 20 years of Blake Harrison's carefully constructed career. In the courthouse corridor, Blake Harrison pulled out his cell phone with hands that were shaking badly enough that it took him 3 tries to unlock the screen, and he called Tony Riggs, called the partner who had stood beside him for 7 years. The partner who had helped him plant evidence in a dozen cases. The partner whose hand had just been captured on video reaching into a glove compartment and destroying both of their lives. The call went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual because Tony might have been in a meeting or might have been somewhere he couldn't answer his phone, and Blake ended the call and tried again, immediately calling a second time with increasing desperation. Voicemail again, and now Blake's hands were shaking worse, and he could feel something building in his chest, something that felt like panic, but that he refused to name as panic, because Blake Harrison didn't panic, had never panicked. In 20 years, had always been the one in control. He called a third time, and this time someone answered. But it wasn't Tony. Riggs's voice wasn't the familiar drawl that Blake had heard every day for 7 years. Wasn't anyone Blake recognized at all. The voice that answered Tony's phone was calm and professional, and carried the particular authority that federal agents develop over years of dealing with people who are having the worst days of their lives. "This is Special Agent Kevin Drummond of the FBI's Civil Rights Unit," the voice said, and Blake felt his stomach drop, felt the ground underneath him give way, felt everything he'd built over 20 years begin to collapse. "Detective Riggs is in federal custody. Is this Detective Blake Harrison?" Blake hung up, immediately ended the call with a stab of his finger that was more like a violent reflex than a deliberate decision, and he stood in the courthouse corridor with his phone in his hand, and his platinum blonde hair perfectly trimmed, and his charcoal suit perfectly pressed, and his entire world falling apart around him like a building whose foundation had been secretly removed. For the first time in a very long time, for the first time in 20 years of getting away with it, Blake Harrison felt genuinely afraid, felt the cold certainty that this wasn't going to end the way he'd always assumed it would end, that the machinery that had always protected him was now turning to look at him with the same merciless efficiency it had used to grind up the people he'd targeted. Meanwhile, on the 4th floor of the courthouse, in an office with Franklin Pierce's name on the door in gold letters, Amanda Cross was on her phone with the district attorney himself, speaking in the clipped low tones of someone delivering news that they were still processing news that was so unexpected and so damaging that it required careful phrasing to even begin to explain. Franklin Pierce, for his part, was very still in his large leather chair, asking short, precise questions and receiving answers that made his silver hair seem somehow to have gone slightly grayer over the course of this 10-minute phone call, made the lines around his eyes deepen, made him look suddenly older than his 58 years. "Video evidence," Franklin asked. "Clear video showing Riggs planting the cocaine?" Amanda replied. "Defense disclosed this morning." "Yes, but I didn't review it before trial. A pause in Franklin's voice when it came back carried a weight that suggested he was already calculating the damage, already running through scenarios, already planning how to minimize the fallout from this disaster. "How bad is this, Amanda?" "It's bad," she said simply. "It's very bad." Harrison invoked his right to counsel on the stand. The jury saw everything. The gallery saw everything. The media is already here. Franklin was quiet for a long moment, and Amanda could almost hear him thinking, could almost see him sitting in his office, looking at the commendations on his wall and the photographs of himself with various elected officials, and wondering how many of those relationships would survive what was about to happen. "Recommend dismissal," Franklin said finally. "Move to dismiss all charges immediately. Do not let this case continue. Do not give the defense any more opportunities to put evidence on the record. Cut our losses now." "Understood," Amanda said, and she ended the call and sat at her desk in the courthouse office that had been assigned to her for the duration of this trial, and she looked at the files stacked in front of her at the other cases she was prosecuting, at the conviction statistics that she'd worked so hard to maintain. And she wondered how many of those convictions had been built on evidence that Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs had manufactured. How many people were sitting in prison cells right now because she'd been too focused on winning to ask the questions she should have asked. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere in courtroom 14 had changed in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to miss a shift in the air itself that came from everyone present. Understanding that they were no longer watching a routine drug possession trial, but rather witnessing something that would be talked about for years, something that would be studied in law schools and training academies, something that would change the way people in Ashford City thought about their police department and their justice system, and the gap between what those institutions claimed to be and what they actually were. Amanda Cross stood at the prosecution table, and her files were still organized in perfect stacks with their color-coded tabs. But the confidence she'd brought to this trial had been replaced by something that looked almost like exhaustion, like someone who had been running a race only to discover that the finish line she'd been aiming for had never existed at all. She addressed Judge Morales with the kind of formal precision that prosecutors use when they're about to do something unprecedented, something that goes against every instinct they've developed over years of fighting to win cases rather than lose them. "Your Honor," Amanda said, and her voice carried across the silent courtroom. With a clarity that made every word seem weighted with significance, the people moved to dismiss all charges against the defendant. Judge Morales looked at her for a beat, her reading glasses reflecting the courtroom lights in a way that made her expression difficult to read, and then she asked the question that procedure required, even though everyone in the room could guess the answer. "On what grounds?" Counsel evidence tampering Amanda replied, and the words seemed to cost her something to say, seemed to be an admission, not just about this case, but about her entire career, about all the other cases where she'd trusted police testimony without questioning it closely enough. The integrity of the arrest has been compromised. The video evidence clearly shows that the controlled substance allegedly discovered in the defendant's vehicle was placed there by law enforcement rather than being lawfully seized. Under these circumstances, the prosecution cannot in good conscience continue to pursue these charges. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation, spectators leaning toward each other to whisper reactions, journalists typing furiously on their phones. But Judge Morales raised one hand, and the buzzing stopped immediately, everyone recognizing the gesture of a judge who was about to speak and expected to be heard. "The motion to dismiss is," Judge Morales began, and then she paused, looking not at Amanda, but at Theodore Calloway, and there was something in her expression that suggested she had just realized that this case had more layers than what they'd seen so far, that the defense attorney who had orchestrated this revelation might have additional surprises waiting. "Mr. Calloway," she said any objection to the dismissal. Theo stood, and he stood slowly, and everyone in the courtroom watched him stand because they could sense that something important was about to happen. could feel the way the moment was gathering weight, could recognize the careful deliberateness of his movements as the movements of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. "No objection to dismissal, Your Honor," Theo said. And then he paused. Let the pause extend just long enough that it became noticeable, became something that commanded attention, and then he added, "However, the defense has an additional motion." Judge Morales's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of surprise on a face that was otherwise carefully neutral. "I'll hear it." Theo placed both hands on the podium in front of him, a gesture that looked almost like a preacher preparing to deliver a sermon, and he looked out at the courtroom, at the 91 spectators in the gallery and the jury still seated in their box, and the court reporter with her fingers poised over her stenography machine, and he said words that would be remembered and repeated and quoted for years to come. "Your Honor, we move that the court receive into evidence the full investigative file compiled over the past 38 months by my client," Theo said, and his voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the courtroom without him raising it above a conversational volume. And then came the pause that every person in that courtroom would remember for the rest of their lives. The pause before everything changed. The pause before the truth was revealed in a way that could never be taken back or explained away or minimized. Theo drew a breath and continued. Special Investigative Counsel Darnell A. Cooper of the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Office of Police Accountability. The silence that followed was not ordinary. Silence was not the simple absence of sound, but rather something more profound and more unsettling. The silence of a room in which something structural had just shifted, like the moment after an earthquake when the ground has stopped shaking. But nothing is in the same place it was before, when everyone is still processing what just happened and trying to understand what it means and what comes next. Judge Patricia Morales's reading glasses came off her nose slowly, so slowly that the movement seemed to happen in stages, and she looked at Darnell Cooper with an expression that had transformed completely from her earlier professional skepticism into something that contained shock and understanding, and the dawning realization that everything she'd thought she understood about this case had been wrong from the very beginning. "The defendant is a federal officer?" she asked, and her voice carried a note of something that might have been wonder, or might have been anger at having been kept in the dark, at having presided over a trial without knowing that one of the participants was not who he appeared to be. Darnell stood, and he had been waiting for this moment for 38 months, had been building toward it through hundreds of hours of investigation and dozens of meetings in federal offices, and weeks of sitting in a holding cell, and days of sitting at this defense table pretending to be just another defendant when he was actually something very different. And the expression on his face was not triumph, was not satisfaction, was not any of the emotions that people might have expected. It was quieter than that, more settled, the expression of someone who has been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down, the expression of someone who has done what needed to be done and can now rest. Special Investigative Counsel. "Yes, Your Honor," Darnell said, and his voice was calm and professional, and carried the authority of someone who had spent 8 years as an assistant United States attorney before taking on this specialized role. "My identification and credentials are in Defense Exhibit C, along with a letter from the Deputy Director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, Dr. Evelyn Moss, confirming my appointment and the mandate of my investigation into organized corruption within the Ashford City Police Department." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a leather credential case and several folded documents, and he walked them to the clerk with measured steps, and the clerk took them and passed them to Judge Morales. And the entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as she unfolded the documents and began to read. The credentials were official, bearing the seal of the Department of Justice, and a photograph of Darnell, and a signature from the Attorney General himself and the letter from Dr. Evelyn Moss was typed on official letterhead and explained in formal bureaucratic language that Darnell Cooper had been appointed to investigate allegations of systematic evidence planting and civil rights violations within certain law enforcement agencies, that his investigation had been authorized at the highest levels of the federal government, and that his work had been classified to protect the integrity of the operation. Judge Morales read the documents in silence, and her face changed as she read the professional mask slipping to reveal someone who was processing information that fundamentally altered her understanding not just of this case, but of her entire court system, of the cases she'd presided over, of the police officers whose testimony she'd trusted without question. When she finished reading, she set the documents down on her bench with a care that suggested they were precious or dangerous or both, and she looked out at the gallery with an expression that was difficult to interpret, but that seemed to contain elements of vindication and anger and a determination that whatever came next would be done correctly, would be done by the book, would be done in a way that honored the truth that had just been revealed. She found Blake Harrison sitting 5 rows back in the gallery, his platinum blonde hair still perfectly trimmed, but his face having aged what looked like 10 years in the past 30 minutes. His hands resting on his knees and his expression completely empty of the smirk that had been his constant companion for the past 4 weeks. His entire body language communicating the posture of someone who has just realized that they've been outplayed, outmaneuvered, caught in a trap that they never saw coming. Judge Morales looked at Blake Harrison for a long moment, and then she said in a voice that was entirely controlled but that contained something hard as granite underneath the control, something that suggested 22 years on the bench had prepared her for exactly this moment, even if she'd never experienced it before. "Bailiff, please detain Detective Harrison." The bailiff moved immediately, walking down the gallery aisle toward Blake with handcuffs already in hand, and Blake stood up not because he was asked to, but because he understood that resistance would accomplish nothing, that the machinery he'd relied on for 20 years to protect him had turned against him. That there was no exit from this situation except through whatever legal process came next. And as the bailiff reached Blake and began to read him his rights and place the handcuffs around his wrists, the same handcuffs that Blake had placed around Darnell's wrists 4 weeks ago, Rosa Tucker felt her granddaughter's hand grip hers so tightly it hurt, felt Jasmine trembling beside her, and Rosa looked down at this 10-year-old child who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had spent 19 months wondering why her father wasn't coming home, who had been told by teachers and social workers and well-meaning adults that sometimes parents make bad choices and have to face consequences. Grandma Jasmine whispered, and her voice was breaking with emotions that her 10-year-old vocabulary didn't have words for yet. Emotions that were too large and too complicated to fit into simple categories like happy or sad or angry. Does this mean Rosa Tucker, who had spent 19 months being told she was wrong? Being told that the evidence doesn't lie? Being told that her son must have done something to deserve his conviction? Being told to accept reality and move on and stop making trouble? Rosa Tucker, who had sat in courtrooms and police stations and prison visiting rooms, refusing to believe that her son was guilty, because she knew him, knew his heart, knew that the man they'd convicted wasn't the man she'd raised. Rosa Tucker pulled her granddaughter close and felt tears streaming down her face for the first time in 19 months. Tears that she'd been holding back because crying meant admitting defeat, and she'd refused to admit defeat. "It means your daddy was telling the truth," baby Rosa said, and her voice was breaking too, was coming apart under the weight of 19 months of vindication, arriving all at once. "It means your daddy was telling the truth all along, and someone finally listened. Someone finally believed him. Someone finally did something about it." Around them, the courtroom was erupting into noise, spectators standing and talking and moving toward the exits, journalists pushing to get closer to the front, to see Blake Harrison being led away in handcuffs, court officers trying to maintain some semblance of order in a situation that had gone from routine to unprecedented in the space of 30 minutes. But in their small corner of the gallery, Rosa and Jasmine held each other and cried, and the weight of 19 months of disbelief was finally lifting, being replaced by something that felt like hope, but stronger than hope, something that felt like justice, but sweeter than justice, something that felt like the moment when you've been holding your breath underwater for so long that your lungs are burning, and you finally break the surface and take that first desperate gulp of air. Blake Harrison was escorted out of courtroom 14 in handcuffs, and the silence that followed his departure was different from the silence that had come before, was the silence of people processing what they'd just witnessed, was the silence of a community beginning to understand that the corruption they'd suspected but couldn't prove had just been proven beyond any doubt, had just been documented and recorded and entered into the permanent record where it could never be denied or explained away. And Darnell Cooper, who had spent 38 months building this case, piece by piece, who had let himself be arrested and handcuffed and processed through the system so he could understand exactly what Blake Harrison's other victims had experienced, who had sat in a holding cell for 43 hours, knowing that one phone call could end it, but refusing to make that call because the truth needed to be revealed in a courtroom where it would be documented forever. Darnell stood at the defense table with Theo Calloway beside him and felt the weight of those 38 months finally lift from his shoulders. He had done what needed to be done, had built a case that couldn't be dismissed or minimized or explained away, had created a record that would last forever. And now the rest of it, the arrests and the trials and the sentencing and all the machinery of federal justice, would proceed without him needing to carry it anymore. The still water was finally calm. Blake Harrison was arrested in courtroom 14, handcuffed by a bailiff who had watched him testify in dozens of cases over the years, had seen him present evidence and swear oaths and send people to prison with testimony that everyone had assumed was truthful. Because why would a decorated police officer lie? And now that bailiff was reading Blake his Miranda rights in the same formal monotone that Blake himself had used countless times when arresting other people. He was walked past 91 spectators who had come to watch what they thought would be a routine drug possession trial, and were instead leaving with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. A story about the day they watched a corrupt cop get caught on video and then get arrested in the same courtroom where he'd expected to watch his victim get convicted. The walk from the defense table to the courtroom door was maybe 30 feet. But it felt longer than that, felt like walking through a gauntlet of eyes and judgment and whispered conversations, felt like every step was carrying Blake further away from the life he'd built and closer to a reckoning that he'd spent 20 years assuming would never come. The silence as he was led out was more devastating than any noise, could have been more crushing than shouting or jeering or any kind of vocal condemnation. Because the silence meant that people were processing what they'd seen, were updating their understanding of how the world worked, were recognizing that the badge and the uniform and the 20 years of service hadn't meant what they'd thought it meant. Tony Riggs, as Blake had already discovered during the recess when he'd called his partner's phone and reached an FBI agent instead, had been picked up by Special Agent Kevin Drummond's team at 9:50 that morning, approximately 10 minutes before court had even reconvened at his apartment complex on the south side of Ashford City, in a neighborhood where the rent was cheap and the buildings were old and the parking lot had potholes that never got fixed. Tony had answered his door in a bathrobe, having called in sick that morning with what he'd told the desk sergeant was a stomach bug, planning to spend the day in his apartment watching television and not thinking about the trial, not worrying about what was happening in courtroom 14, because Blake had always handled the courtroom part and Tony had always just followed his lead. He'd thought the knock on his door was the building superintendent coming to tell him something about the water heater, or the plumbing, or one of the other perpetual problems with a building that was 40 years old and hadn't been properly maintained in at least 15 of those years. It was not the building superintendent. It was Special Agent Kevin Drummond and 3 other federal agents, all of them wearing FBI windbreakers and carrying credentials and showing a warrant that had been signed by a federal judge at 8:30 that morning, authorizing Tony's arrest on charges of civil rights violations, evidence tampering conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Tony reportedly said nothing for the first 45 minutes of federal custody, just sat in the back of the FBI vehicle, with his hands cuffed behind him and his bathrobe looking ridiculous. In the context of a federal arrest, just stared out the window and said nothing, while the agents tried various approaches to get him talking. And then somewhere around the 46-minute mark, Tony started talking. And once he started, he couldn't seem to stop, couldn't seem to prevent the words from pouring out in a flood of cooperation and confession and desperate attempts to minimize his own culpability by explaining that it had been Blake's idea, that Blake had been the one running the operation, that Tony had just been following orders from his partner and his superior officer. The things Tony said in those first few hours of cooperation would later form the basis for additional arrests, would connect dots that Darnell's investigation had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove definitively, would expand the scope of the federal case beyond just Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs to include other officers and supervisors who had enabled or participated in or profited from the corruption. The district attorney's office began its internal review at 2:15 p.m. on the same day, less than 2 hours after the video had been played in courtroom 14, less than 2 hours after Blake Harrison had been arrested, and Amanda Cross had moved to dismiss charges, and everything had fallen apart in a way that made it clear this wasn't just one bad arrest, but rather the visible tip of something much larger and more troubling. Franklin Pierce issued a statement at 4:45 p.m., standing in front of the courthouse steps with his silver hair catching the late afternoon light, reading from prepared remarks that his press secretary had helped him write, announcing that his office was cooperating fully with federal investigators and conducting a comprehensive review of all drug cases prosecuted in the past decade that had originated with arrests by Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs. The statement was carefully worded, designed to convey appropriate concern without admitting culpability, designed to demonstrate leadership and accountability without actually accepting responsibility for the fact that his office had been prosecuting cases based on manufactured evidence for years without catching it. What the statement did not mention, what Franklin had been told privately by an FBI liaison in a phone call that had made his hands shake, was that the review was not optional, was not a courtesy that the federal government was requesting, but rather a requirement that was being imposed, and that his own office's handling of potentially tainted evidence was also being examined by investigators who had access to resources and authority that made state-level obstruction impossible. Amanda Cross was not named in any of the initial press releases, was not mentioned in Franklin's statement, was not identified as someone who had done anything wrong. But Amanda sat in her office that evening after everyone else had left, after the journalists had stopped calling and the colleagues had stopped knocking on her door to ask if she was okay. And she looked at the case files stacked on her desk, the ones she'd prosecuted over the past 5 years, the ones that had come from Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs, and she saw them differently now. She saw the ones she had taken at face value, the ones where defendants had maintained their innocence, and she dismissed those protestations as the predictable denials that everyone made, the ones where the evidence had seemed solid and the convictions had seemed righteous, and her conscience had been clear because she'd been doing her job, winning cases, serving justice. Except now she understood that she hadn't been serving justice at all, had been serving something else, had been serving her own career ambitions and her conviction statistics, and a systematic pattern of assumptions about who deserved to be believed and who deserved to be dismissed. And the accounting she was doing in her head, the calculation of how many people might be sitting in prison cells right now because she had been too focused on winning to ask the hard questions that accounting was not coming out in her favor. She would later cooperate with federal investigators, would testify against Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs in their federal trials, would acknowledge in sworn depositions that she had pursued convictions with what she now recognized as a willful incuriosity about their foundations, a deliberate choice not to look too closely at evidence that fit her preferred narrative. She would lose her position at the district attorney's office, would be asked to resign 6 weeks after the video went public, would be told that while she wasn't being criminally charged, her employment was being terminated because the office needed to demonstrate accountability, and she had become fairly or unfairly the public face of the prosecution's failure to catch the corruption. This was the subject of considerable debate in legal circles and on editorial pages, whether Amanda Cross was a villain who had willfully ignored evidence of corruption, or whether she was a victim of a system that had trained her to trust police testimony without question, whether she deserved to be punished, or whether she deserved sympathy, or whether those two things weren't actually mutually exclusive. In the Riverside district of Ashford City, in a warehouse on Porter Industrial Road that looked abandoned from the outside but was actually a functioning distribution center for cocaine and methamphetamine moving through the region, a man named Vincent Kane was arrested at 7:15 p.m. by a joint FBI and DEA task force that had been planning this operation for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to execute the warrants. Vincent Kane was a mid-level drug distributor not important enough to be on anyone's most wanted list, but successful enough to have built a network of dealers and customers and corrupt police officers who protected his operation in exchange for money that came in the form of real estate purchases and tuition payments and all the other ways that cash gets laundered into legitimate-seeming assets. The connection between Vincent Kane and Blake Harrison's cabin in Tennessee had been documented in Section 5 of Darnell's investigative file, traced through 6 layers of corporate paperwork by forensic accountants who specialized in following money trails that people had worked very hard to obscure, and now that connection was being used as the basis for Vincent's arrest on charges that included not just drug distribution, but also conspiracy to obstruct justice and bribery of a public official. Vincent had been cooperating with federal investigators under a proffer agreement for 16 months, ever since Darnell's investigation had identified him and offered him an arrangement that was simple and non-negotiable full disclosure in exchange for a reduced sentence, complete cooperation in exchange for a recommendation of leniency when his case eventually went to sentencing. Vincent Kane was a pragmatic man who understood that loyalty was a luxury he couldn't afford, when the alternative was spending the rest of his life in federal prison, and he had taken the deal and spent the past 16 months providing detailed information about his business relationship with Blake Harrison, about the drugs he'd provided that ended up being planted in Defendant's vehicles, about the money he'd paid that ended up financing Blake's lifestyle in ways that a police salary could never support. The cooperation had begun when Darnell's investigation had first identified Vincent, when federal agents had shown up at one of his distribution points with enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, and an offer that would reduce that to maybe 5 if he helped them build a case against the corrupt cops who were his business partners. Vincent had looked at the evidence, had understood immediately that fighting would be futile, had made the calculation that rich men and smart men make when they're caught, which is that saving yourself is more important than protecting people who would abandon you in a heartbeat if the situations were reversed. His cooperation had been one of the evidentiary foundations of the financial section of Darnell's file, had provided details about transactions and payments and arrangements that would have been nearly impossible to document any other way, had helped establish the money trail that connected Blake's unexplained wealth to the drugs being planted in innocent people's cars. By the end of the 3rd day after the video was shown in court, by the time 72 hours had passed since Blake Harrison had said, "I want a lawyer," from the witness stand and destroyed his own life. With 4 words, the tally of arrests directly connected to Darnell Cooper's investigation stood at 8 people whose careers and lives were now in various states of collapse. Blake Harrison, arrested in the courtroom, charged with 26 federal counts, sitting in a federal holding facility, refusing to talk to anyone except his lawyer. Tony Riggs, arrested at his apartment, cooperating extensively, providing information about other officers and other cases, trying desperately to reduce his own exposure by offering up everyone else. 5 other officers whose names had emerged from Tony's cooperation and Vincent's testimony, officers who had been involved peripherally in the corruption, who had provided cover or looked the other way or accepted money in exchange for silence. Officers who had thought their involvement was minor enough that they'd never be caught. Vincent Kane, the drug distributor who had financed Blake's lifestyle and provided the cocaine that ended up being planted facing his own federal charges, but with a cooperation agreement that would reduce his sentence significantly. And a seventh arrest came 1 week later, came after Tony Riggs had been talking for days, and had finally mentioned a name that Darnell's investigation had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove definitively the name of the person who had made all of this possible by providing administrative protection from internal affairs investigations. Police Captain Harold Montgomery, 62 years old, had been with the Ashford City Police Department for 38 years, had risen through the ranks, from patrol officer to detective to sergeant to lieutenant to captain, had spent the last 15 years in an administrative role that gave him authority over internal affairs, investigations, and disciplinary proceedings, and all the other mechanisms that were supposed to keep police officers accountable. Harold was the administrative architecture that made it possible for Blake Harrison's operation to function without interference, was the person who had sealed the original internal affairs file on Blake, was the person who had made complaints disappear before they could be formally investigated, was the person who had protected corrupt officers in exchange for money that had accumulated over the years into a retirement account containing approximately $390,000 in deposits that couldn't be explained by his salary. Harold Montgomery was arrested at his home in a gated community in the northwest suburbs of Ashford City, in a house with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool and landscaping that required professional maintenance in a neighborhood where all the houses looked basically the same, and all the families looked basically the same, and nobody asked too many questions about where anyone's money came from as long as they kept their lawns mowed and their hedges trimmed. The federal agents arrived at 6:30 in the morning, early enough that Harold was still in his bathrobe drinking coffee on his back porch and reading the news on his tablet early enough that the neighbors were just starting their own morning routines and could watch through their windows as the FBI descended on Captain Montgomery's house with warrants and credentials and the absolute authority of the federal government. Harold reportedly sat down on his front porch steps when the agents showed him the warrant. Just sat down like his legs couldn't hold him anymore, and he wept. Cried in a way that surprised the agents who had expected resistance or denial or lawyering up. Cried like someone who had been carrying a secret for too long and was relieved to finally have it taken away, even though the cost of that relief would be years in federal prison. The case that Darnell Cooper had built over 38 months. The case that had consumed 3 years and 2 months of his life and required him to subordinate everything else to this single mission. The case that had demanded he let himself be arrested and handcuffed and caged so he could understand in his body what 12 other people had experienced when Blake Harrison targeted them. That case was submitted in its entirety to the United States District Court for the Northern District of Mississippi on November 18th, exactly 1 week after the video had been shown in courtroom 14. The federal charges against Blake Harrison alone numbered 26 counts, a number that reflected not just the scope of his corruption, but the meticulous care with which Darnell and his team had documented every violation, every instance of evidence tampering, every civil rights abuse that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a federal courtroom. The charges included civil rights violations under Title 42 United States Code, Section 1983, the federal statute that makes it illegal for government officials to deprive people of their constitutional rights. The statute that was designed specifically to address situations where state and local officials abuse their power and the normal mechanisms of accountability fail to stop them. They included evidence tampering charges that carried severe penalties, because tampering with evidence strikes at the heart of the justice system itself, makes it impossible for courts to function properly, transforms the entire machinery of law enforcement into a weapon that can be used against innocent people rather than a shield protecting them. They included conspiracy charges that encompassed not just Blake and Tony, but also the other officers, and Vincent Kane and Harold Montgomery, all of them working together in an organized effort to manufacture arrests and convictions and destroy lives for reasons that ranged from career advancement to financial profit to the simple exercise of power over people who couldn't fight back. They included obstruction of justice charges related to the ways that internal affairs investigations had been buried. Complaints had been disappeared. Evidence had been destroyed or hidden, all the administrative mechanisms that should have caught this corruption, but instead protected it. And they included wire fraud charges connected to the financial transactions that had allowed Blake to maintain a lifestyle his salary couldn't support, the electronic transfers and corporate filings and real estate purchases that had been designed to hide the source of money that came from destroying innocent people's lives. The 12 defendants whose cases had been identified as potentially tainted by Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs. The 12 people who had maintained their innocence throughout their prosecutions and convictions, and who had been dismissed as liars claiming victim status to avoid responsibility for their crimes. Those 12 cases were immediately referred for review by the Georgia Innocence Project and a special federal review panel that had been convened specifically to handle the fallout from Darnell's investigation. The process moved faster than such processes typically moved, propelled by public outrage and media attention and political pressure from elected officials who understood that their constituents wanted to see justice done quickly and visibly wanted to see innocent people freed and guilty cops imprisoned without the usual delays that characterized the criminal justice system. Within 7 weeks of Darnell's trial in courtroom 14, within 7 weeks of that video being played for 91 spectators and 12 jurors and one judge who would never forget what they'd seen, 3 of the incarcerated defendants had been released pending full case reviews, their convictions suspended while lawyers and investigators examined the evidence and determined whether it had been manufactured or legitimate. Their names deserved to be said, clearly deserved to be spoken aloud and remembered and honored as people, rather than case numbers or statistics, deserved to be recognized as human beings who had suffered injustice and survived it and were now being given back some portion of what had been stolen from them. Isaiah Tucker, 38 years old, father of Jasmine, husband of a woman named Maria, who had died of breast cancer while Isaiah was in prison, fighting charges he swore were false maintenance worker at Riverside Elementary School, where he'd fixed broken desks and replaced ceiling tiles and kept the building running for children who deserved better facilities than the school district could afford to provide. Isaiah had served 19 months of a 5-year sentence, 19 months during which his daughter had grown from 8 years old to nearly 10, 19 months during which he'd missed birthday parties and school plays and the ordinary moments of childhood that you can never get back once they're gone, 19 months during which his wife had fought cancer without him, and lost that fight, and died believing that her husband was in prison because he'd made terrible choices. Cameron Ellis, 44 years old, worked as a welder before his arrest, skilled at the kind of precise metalwork that required steady hands and good eyes, and the ability to focus completely on the task in front of you, arrested on charges he denied from the moment Blake Harrison put handcuffs on him. Cameron had served 31 months of a 6-year sentence, 31 months during which his employer, Pete Holloway, had kept telling people that Cameron was innocent, that the conviction was wrong, that Cameron would be back as soon as the truth came out. 31 months during which Cameron had maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen, even though almost nobody listened, because maintaining innocence was what everyone in prison claimed to do. And Terrence Mills, 21 years old now, but only 19 when he'd been arrested. The young, terrified kid who had been in the holding cell with Darnell on that first night. The kid with the swollen eye and split lip from resisting arrest, even though he'd never resisted anything except being told he was guilty when he knew he wasn't. Terrence had served 11 months of a 3-year sentence. 11 months that had interrupted his plans to attend community college and study business administration, 11 months that had given him a criminal record that would follow him forever, even after his conviction was vacated. 11 months that had taught him things about injustice and power, and the gap between how the system was supposed to work and how it actually worked. Isaiah Tucker's release took place on a cold December morning when the sun was just starting to break through clouds that had covered Ashford City for 3 days straight, and Rosa Tucker was there with Jasmine, both of them standing outside the correctional facility waiting for the doors to open and for Isaiah to walk out into freedom after 19 months of being caged. Rosa gave a brief statement to the journalists who had gathered, because this was news. This was a story that people wanted to hear. This was proof that the corruption exposed in courtroom 14 had real consequences for real people. She stood in front of the cameras with her granddaughter beside her, and she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with tears, "I never stopped believing he was telling the truth. Never stopped believing that my son was innocent. And I want to thank Mr. Darnell Cooper for doing what needed to be done to make people listen." And then she held her son in the November air, held him tight enough that 19 months of separation could feel like they were being compressed into this single moment of reunion, held him while Jasmine stood watching with tears streaming down her face. And then Jasmine couldn't wait anymore, couldn't stand there watching, couldn't maintain any kind of composure or restraint. And she ran to her father, this 10-year-old girl who had spent 19 months being told that her daddy had made bad choices and had to face consequences, ran to him shouting, "Daddy! Daddy!" with her voice breaking on the word. Isaiah dropped to his knees on the concrete sidewalk outside the correctional facility, his body responding before his mind could process what was happening. And he caught his daughter as she crashed into him, both of them sobbing, now both of them holding each other like they were afraid that if they let go, this moment would disappear and they'd be separated again. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," Isaiah kept saying, his voice muffled against Jasmine's hair. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't come home. I'm so sorry. You had to wait so long. I'm so sorry." And Jasmine, 10 years old, with her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn refusal to accept injustice, said through her tears, "It's okay, Daddy. It's okay." The truth won. Mr. Cooper made them listen to the truth. Isaiah looked over his daughter's shoulder at his mother, at Rosa, who had raised him and who had never given up on him, even when it seemed like everyone else had, and mother and son's eyes met. And everything that needed to be said passed between them in that look, all the pain and the vindication and the love that had sustained them through 19 months of separation. The body camera footage, that 4-minute and 18-second clip of Tony Riggs planting evidence in Darnell Cooper's rental car, was released to the media following the court proceedings made public as part of the official record once the charges had been dismissed and the federal investigation had been revealed. Within hours of its release, the hashtag justice for Isaiah began trending nationally on social media, named for Isaiah Tucker, who had been identified in news reports as one of Blake Harrison's victims, the first victim whose story the media had told in detail, the father of a 10-year-old girl who had waited 19 months to hug him again. By midnight on the day the video was released, it had been shared 340,000 times across various platforms, reposted and retweeted and sent in messages to friends and family and strangers who needed to see it, who needed to understand that this wasn't a conspiracy theory or an exaggeration, but rather documented fact, recorded evidence of exactly how corrupt police officers destroyed innocent people's lives. The video was viewed 52 million times in the first week. 52 million instances of people watching Tony Riggs's hand reach into that glove compartment, watching Blake Harrison pretend to be surprised by what he'd orchestrated, watching the mechanical process by which evidence was manufactured and lives were destroyed. Civil rights organizations issued statements calling for comprehensive reform of police accountability mechanisms, calling for mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off, calling for independent oversight of internal affairs investigations, calling for all the things that advocates had been calling for years, but that now had renewed urgency because the video made the problem undeniable. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the case, examining how Darnell's undercover operation had been structured, questioning whether it was ethical for a federal prosecutor to allow himself to be falsely arrested, debating whether the ends justified the means, ultimately concluding, in most cases, that yes, when the corruption was this deep and this protected, extraordinary measures were necessary to root it out. Ordinary people who had never heard of Ashford City or Blake Harrison or Darnell Cooper watched the video on their phones and their computers and shared it with comments that ranged from outrage to vindication to despair about a system that allowed this to happen. Rosa Tucker's doorbell rang constantly in the days after Isaiah's release. Journalists wanting interviews, activists wanting to include her story in their advocacy campaigns, neighbors who had previously kept their distance now coming by to say they'd always believed Isaiah was innocent, even though most of them hadn't. The Alliance for Justice in Policing, the community organization that had existed in Ashford City for years but had operated with limited resources and minimal public attention, suddenly found itself at the center of a national conversation about police accountability. The organization, which had operated with 14 members and a borrowed office space and an annual budget that wouldn't cover a week's salary for most professionals, now had a waiting list of volunteers. A GoFundMe campaign that had raised $520,000 in 84 hours and invitations to speak at conferences and city council meetings and state legislative hearings. Rosa became a co-chair of the organization, using her experience navigating the criminal justice system to help other families who were fighting similar battles, who were trying to prove that their loved ones were innocent when the system had already decided they were guilty. The viral comments that accompanied the video told their own story about what people understood and what they were feeling. People need to see it, not read about it secondhand. They need to watch a dirty cop plant evidence in real time and understand this isn't conspiracy theory. This is Tuesday. Shared 19,000 times. How many Isaiah Tuckers are sitting in cells right now because we believed the badge instead of the man? How many Jasmines are growing up without their fathers because we didn't ask the hard questions, shared 34,000 times? That little girl waited 19 months to hug her father. 19 months of her childhood stolen by a lie. How do we give that back? We can't. All we can do is make sure it doesn't happen to the next child. Shared 41,000 times. A legal commentator named Harold Riggs, speaking on a national television program watched by millions of people, called the footage the most consequential piece of body camera evidence in the history of American policing cases. And while this was possibly an overstatement driven by the immediate emotional impact of what he'd just seen, it was also possibly not an overstatement at all, possibly exactly correct, possibly the kind of historical assessment that would hold up decades later when people looked back and tried to understand when the conversation about police accountability shifted from abstract debate to concrete action. The footage became required viewing in police academies and law schools, became a case study in how corruption works when it's protected by institutional power, became a teaching tool for explaining why oversight matters and why transparency matters, and why the people wearing badges need to be held to higher standards rather than lower ones. The federal trial of Blake Harrison began 8 months after his arrest in courtroom 14. 8 months during which he sat in federal custody, because no judge was willing to set bail for someone charged with 26 counts of civil rights violations and evidence tampering. 8 months during which his lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to get the case dismissed or the evidence suppressed or some procedural advantage that might give them leverage to negotiate a plea deal. The trial lasted 4 weeks, took place in the same federal courthouse where Darnell had worked as an assistant United States attorney before taking on his special investigative counsel role, took place in a courtroom that was larger and more formal than courtroom 14, with higher ceilings and better lighting, and the seal of the United States District Court mounted on the wall behind the judge's bench. Theodore Calloway was not the lead attorney in the federal trial because federal prosecutors don't typically work with defense attorneys in that role, because the case was now being handled by the Department of Justice's own trial lawyers, who specialized in prosecuting civil rights violations and public corruption. But Theo was present every day, seated in the gallery in the same seat watching the proceedings with the patient attention of a man who had already done his part and was now simply witnessing the consequences of work he'd helped make possible. Darnell Cooper testified on the 5th day of trial, took the stand in the same courtroom where he'd once sat at the prosecution table arguing cases, and he testified for 7 hours spread across 2 sessions, answering questions from the federal prosecutors and then from Blake's defense team, laying out the architecture of his 38-month investigation with methodical thoroughness. He explained how the investigation had started with a tip from a defense attorney who thought something was wrong with one of Blake Harrison's arrests, explained how pattern analysis had revealed 11 other cases with similar characteristics, explained how surveillance and financial records and informant testimony had gradually built a picture of organized corruption. He explained the decision to let himself be arrested, explained the reasoning behind it in a way that made clear this wasn't recklessness or glory-seeking, but rather a calculated strategy to build an airtight case that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or speculation. He explained how the body camera had been hidden in his lapel pin, explained how he'd positioned himself during the traffic stop to make sure the camera would capture the passenger side of the vehicle where he suspected Tony Riggs would plant the evidence. And most importantly, he testified about what he'd felt during those 43 hours in custody, not in a way that was designed to elicit sympathy, but rather in a way that was designed to help the jury understand why this case mattered, why it was worth the federal government's time and resources to prosecute a police officer for planting evidence. "I needed to understand what Isaiah Tucker felt," Darnell said at one point during his testimony, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone in the courtroom pay attention. "I needed to understand what it's like to know you're innocent, but also know that nobody with power believes you, to feel the system grinding you down minute by minute, to realize that your protestations of innocence sound exactly like the protestations of actual guilty people, and there's no way to prove the difference." The gallery during the federal trial included faces that had become familiar over the 8 months since Blake's arrest. Rosa Tucker and Jasmine there almost every day, watching the man who had destroyed their family face the consequences of his actions. Cameron Ellis, the welder who had gotten his job back and his life back, but would never get back the 31 months he'd lost. Terrence Mills, now enrolled at Ashford Community College studying business administration, working part-time for the Alliance for Justice in Policing, speaking occasionally at community events about his experience. All of them present to witness justice to see with their own eyes that the system could sometimes, not often, but sometimes actually work the way it was supposed to work, could actually hold powerful people accountable when the evidence was strong enough and the political will was there, and someone like Darnell Cooper was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. Blake Harrison's defense team worked as hard as any defense team could work when the evidence against their client included clear video of the crime being committed and extensive financial records documenting the corruption and cooperation testimony from multiple co-conspirators who had decided that saving themselves was more important than protecting Blake. They argued entrapment, that Darnell had manufactured a situation specifically designed to ensnare their client, that this was prosecutorial overreach dressed up as investigation, that the federal government had spent enormous resources targeting one police officer who had made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his entire life destroyed. The argument did not survive. Contact with reality did not survive the video showing Tony Riggs planting evidence, did not survive the financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained wealth, did not survive the forensic batch analysis showing that drugs planted in 4 different cases had all come from the same source, did not survive Tony Riggs's cooperation testimony, which was detailed and specific and devastating in the way that testimony from a co-conspirator who has made peace with his fate tends to be. The jury deliberated for 13 hours, deliberated through an afternoon and evening, and into the next morning, deliberated long enough that some observers started to worry that they might be deadlocked, might be unable to reach a verdict, might end in a mistrial that would require the whole process to start over. But on the morning of the second day of deliberations, the jury sent a note to the judge saying they had reached verdicts on all counts, and everyone filed back into the courtroom, and the jury foreman stood up when asked and read the verdicts one by one. Blake Harrison was convicted on 19 of the 26 counts, convicted on all the civil rights violations and all the evidence tampering charges and most of the conspiracy and obstruction charges, convicted by 12 citizens who had looked at the evidence and determined beyond a reasonable doubt that this police officer had abused his power, had destroyed innocent people's lives, had corrupted the justice system he was supposed to serve. The 7 acquittals were on charges where the evidence chain had a technical procedural issue that Blake's defense attorneys had successfully exploited, where the proof wasn't quite strong enough to meet the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, even though everyone in the courtroom probably believed Blake was guilty of those charges too. When the verdicts were read, when the jury foreman said guilty for the 19th time and sat down, Blake Harrison stood at the defense table and his face was completely still, not composed, the way Darnell's face was composed, not showing the inner calm of someone at peace with themselves, but rather emptied out, showing the expression of a man from whom something fundamental had been removed. He had spent 20 years protected by the weight of institutional authority, by the predictability of a system that treated certain men's testimony as gold and other men's testimony as suspect, by the assumption that people wearing badges were telling the truth and people in handcuffs were lying. For 20 years, the machinery had worked in his favor, had protected him and promoted him and allowed him to destroy lives without consequences. And now the machinery was looking at him with the same merciless efficiency it had used to grind up the people he'd targeted, and there was nowhere left to hide. Blake Harrison was sentenced 3 months after his conviction, sentenced on a spring morning, when cherry blossoms were blooming outside the courthouse and the world seemed to be renewing itself, while Blake's own life was being measured out in decades of federal imprisonment. The sentencing hearing took place in the same courtroom where the trial had been held, presided over by the Honorable Regina Flowers, a federal judge who had been on the bench for 18 years and had a reputation for thoughtful sentencing decisions that balanced the need for punishment with the possibility of redemption. Judge Flowers had read the pre-sentencing reports, had reviewed the impact statements from victims, had considered the arguments from both the prosecution and the defense about what an appropriate sentence would be for someone who had committed these crimes. The prosecution had asked for the maximum sentence on each count to be served consecutively, which would have put Blake in federal prison for the rest of his natural life. The defense had asked for leniency, had argued that Blake had served his community for 20 years before making the mistakes that led to his conviction, had argued that he deserved some credit for that service, had argued that a sentence of 5 or 10 years would be sufficient to serve the purposes of punishment and deterrence. Judge Flowers listened to both arguments, and then she delivered a sentencing statement that would be widely quoted and reprinted in the weeks that followed, that would become part of the permanent record of this case and part of the larger conversation about police accountability and justice. The defendant spent 20 years using the authority of his badge to treat certain citizens as targets, rather than as people deserving of protection, Judge Flowers said, and her voice carried across the courtroom with absolute clarity, with the weight of someone who understood that these words would matter, would be remembered, would become part of how this case was understood. He relied comprehensively and calculatedly on the assumption that those targets would lack the resources, the credibility, or the power to hold him accountable for what he was doing to them. He relied on a pattern of organized corruption that protected him from oversight, that made it possible for him to plant evidence and destroy lives without anyone asking the questions that needed to be asked. She paused, let her words settle in the room, and then continued. He was in that assumption catastrophically wrong. and the weight of that error will be measured in the years he now spends in federal prison years that bear no relationship to the years that Isaiah Tucker and Cameron Ellis and Terrence Mills and 9 other innocent people lost, years that cannot restore what was taken from them, but that can serve as testimony to this nation that the badge does not place any officer above the law, and that justice, however delayed, will eventually find its mark. Judge Flowers sentenced Blake Harrison to 24 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes and the number of victims and the organized nature of the corruption, a sentence that meant Blake would be 70 years old before he became eligible for release, assuming he survived that long, assuming federal prison didn't break him the way he'd broken so many others. Blake was taken from the courtroom by federal marshals, led out through a side door, while his wife sat in the gallery and did not look up from her lap, while his son, who had been in the courtroom every day of the trial, stood and walked out before the marshals reached the door, not looking back, not saying goodbye, not giving any indication that he forgave or understood or would be waiting when his father finally got out. The other sentences followed in subsequent weeks, each one calibrated to reflect the specific level of involvement and cooperation. Tony Riggs, who had cooperated extensively and testified against Blake and provided information about other officers, received a reduced sentence of 10 years, with eligibility for parole after serving 60%, which meant he might be out in 6 years if he continued to cooperate and stayed out of trouble in federal custody. His red hair had started going gray during the months of proceedings, during the stress of being arrested and cooperating and testifying against his partner during the long nights in federal custody, wondering if he'd made the right choice or if he should have stayed loyal and faced the maximum sentence. Harold Montgomery, the captain who had silenced internal affairs complaints and provided administrative protection for the corruption, was sentenced to 9 years, a sentence that reflected his role as an enabler rather than a principal, someone who had made the corruption possible but hadn't directly participated in planting evidence or arresting innocent people. Franklin Pierce, the district attorney, was not criminally charged, though he announced 4 months before the next election that he would not be seeking a 4th term, that he had decided to spend more time with his family. Though nobody who read the statement believed that was the real reason, and everyone understood that he was being pushed out as a sacrifice to public anger about how his office had failed to catch the corruption. In the months following Blake Harrison's sentencing, several things happened that didn't make national headlines, but that mattered enormously to the people directly affected. Small acts of restoration and rebuilding that could never fully compensate for what had been taken, but that represented at least some attempt at making things right. Isaiah Tucker enrolled at Ashford Community College at 38 years old, starting over with the particular determination of someone who understood exactly what they were starting over from someone who had lost 19 months but refused to lose the rest of his life to bitterness or despair. He studied early childhood education, preparing for a career working with young children, and when people asked him why he'd chosen that field, he said simply, "I lost 19 months watching my daughter grow up. I want to spend the rest of my life helping other children grow, helping them learn, helping them understand that they matter, and that their potential is unlimited, and that one person's belief in them can change everything." He filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Ashford, and the Ashford City Police Department, represented pro bono by a civil rights firm in Jackson that had made its reputation taking on exactly these kinds of cases, and the suit settled 20 months later for $1.6 million, an amount that would never compensate for what he'd lost, but that would at least provide financial security for him and his daughter. Isaiah's attorney released a statement saying that the settlement represented accountability, and that they hoped it would serve as a deterrent to future misconduct, but Isaiah himself said nothing, publicly remained a private man who dealt with his trauma in private ways, who focused on rebuilding his life rather than becoming a public figure or advocate. Cameron Ellis, 45 years old by the time his full exoneration was complete, returned to his work as a welder, returned to the precise craft that required steady hands and focused attention and the ability to join things together that had been broken apart. His employer, Pete Holloway, had held his position open based on the belief that Cameron was innocent based on knowing Cameron well enough to trust that the conviction was wrong. And when the exoneration came through, Pete hired Cameron back the same week, didn't make a big deal about it. Just called him up and said there was work waiting when he was ready. Cameron showed up Monday morning and worked a full day without saying much about any of it, which was just who Cameron was. A man who processed things internally, who dealt with pain and injustice and vindication in the quiet spaces of his own mind, rather than in public statements or emotional displays. Terrence Mills, the young terrified kid from the holding cell who was now 22 years old and trying to build a life that made sense after having it interrupted by 11 months in prison, enrolled at Ashford Community College, studying business administration, worked part-time for the nonprofit connected to the Alliance for Justice in Policing, and spoke occasionally at community events about his experience. When he spoke, he always mentioned Darnell always talked about the man in the holding cell who had told him, "I have access to a lawyer," but hadn't explained that he was federal prosecutor building a case, the man who had given him hope when hope seemed impossible. "He gave me something I didn't have before," Terrence said at one community meeting, speaking to a room full of people who were fighting their own battles with the criminal justice system. "He gave me hope that the truth still matters, that if you fight long enough and build a strong enough case, the system can be forced to listen. That's what Mr. Cooper does. He makes the system listen when it doesn't want to." Rosa Tucker became a central figure in the Alliance for Justice in policing, the organization that had existed before the Harrison case, but had grown exponentially in its aftermath, going from 14 members and borrowed office space to a staff of 8 people, and a budget that allowed them to actually help families navigating the criminal justice system. Rosa gave interviews when asked, attended city council meetings to advocate for police reforms, showed up at the state capitol when legislation was being considered that would affect accountability mechanisms, and was, by the accounts of everyone who encountered her, absolutely formidable in her commitment to making sure that what happened to her son didn't happen to anyone else's son. She also kept the newspaper clipping of Isaiah's exoneration framed in her living room, not as a trophy, but as a reminder to never stop believing, to never accept injustice as inevitable, to never let the system convince you that your voice doesn't matter. Jasmine Tucker, now 11 years old, kept her own newspaper clipping on her desk in her bedroom, the one with the headline, "Federal prosecutor lived as defendant to expose corrupt cops," kept it not as a trophy, but as proof that her father's words had been true. That I didn't do it, had been accurate all along, that the truth had just needed someone willing to sit in handcuffs for 43 hours to make a courtroom finally listen. Darnell Cooper continued his work with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, moved on to other investigations in other cities where corruption had taken root and needed to be exposed, where police departments had stopped serving their communities and started preying on them. The Ashford City case became a template that was studied and analyzed and referenced in federal training materials as a model for how organized evidence planting could be documented and prosecuted, how undercover operations could be structured to build airtight cases, how one person's willingness to experience injustice personally could create the foundation for holding an entire department accountable. Darnell gave one interview about the case conducted by a journalist named Patricia Nguyen from the Washington Post, and in that interview, he was asked how he had endured the 43 hours in the holding cell, knowing who he was and what he knew, how he had managed to sit there and not identify himself and end it immediately. His answer, which the Post ran as a pull quote that appeared on social media and in other news outlets, was simple and direct. "I endured it because 12 people before me endured it, without the option of ending it when they chose. The least I could do was understand what they went through. The most I could do was make sure it mattered, make sure their suffering led to change that would protect other people from experiencing the same thing." He declined all subsequent interview requests, went back to his work. went back to building cases and fighting corruption and doing the quiet, necessary work that kept the justice system functioning even when parts of it were broken. Blake Harrison, serving 24 years in federal prison, would have time to consider what he'd done, to think about the lives he'd destroyed and the corruption he'd normalized and the assumptions he'd made about who mattered and who didn't. Whether he used that time for genuine reckoning or for constructing narratives that made him the victim of his own story was a question that nobody outside his cell could answer. Though people who knew him said he'd always been good at constructing those narratives, had always had the specific talent of a man who could convince himself completely and almost sincerely that his version of events was the true one, regardless of what the evidence showed. Whether 24 years was enough to dismantle that kind of self-deception, nobody knew, and probably nobody would ever know, because some questions don't have answers that can be verified from the outside. Tony Riggs, at 10 years with parole possible at 6, had reportedly requested from within the federal facility in Tennessee where he was housed a meeting with Isaiah Tucker's attorney, wanted to apologize or explain, or maybe just look someone in the eye who had been affected by what he'd done. The request was passed along through official channels, forwarded to Isaiah's attorney, who forwarded it to Isaiah himself, and Isaiah's response was brief and unambiguous. Not yet. Not yet is not. Never. And Isaiah left open the possibility that someday, maybe years from now, maybe when enough time had passed that the anger had cooled and the wound had scarred over, he might be willing to have that conversation. But it's also not forgiveness, and nobody with any sense would ask Isaiah Tucker to move faster towards something he would arrive at on his own terms, or not arrive at all. Because forgiveness is not something that can be demanded or expected or put on a timeline that makes other people comfortable. In the spring, following Blake Harrison's sentencing, when the cherry blossoms had finished blooming and given way to the full green of early summer, Darnell Cooper returned to Ashford City for the first time since the verdict had been read in that federal courtroom 8 months earlier. He came quietly without announcement or advance notice, driving his own car rather than a rental. This time a gray Ford Explorer with 85,000 miles on it and a crack in the passenger sun visor and all the ordinary imperfections of a vehicle that was used for transportation rather than image. He drove through the Riverside district where this had all begun. Drove down Brennan Avenue past the intersection with 12th Street, where Blake Harrison had pulled him over on that October night that felt like it had happened in a different lifetime, even though it had only been 18 months ago. He stopped at the red light at that intersection and sat there for one full light cycle, red to green to red again, and what he was thinking during those 2 minutes he never said to anyone, never wrote down, never shared in any of the rare interviews he gave about the case. Maybe there was nothing that needed to be said about it. Maybe some reckonings are private. Maybe some justice is internal and lives in your body rather than in press releases or public statements. Maybe the satisfaction of having done what needed to be done is enough without needing to articulate it or perform it or turn it into something that other people can consume. Before leaving Ashford City, Darnell made one stop that wasn't on any official schedule, drove to Rosa Tucker's house in a neighborhood where the streets needed repaving and the houses needed fresh paint, but where families had lived for generations and knew each other's names and looked out for each other's children. Rosa answered the door with Jasmine beside her, and Jasmine was taller now, 11 years old, and growing into someone who would carry the memory of these events for the rest of her life, who would tell her own children someday about the year her father came home because a federal prosecutor was willing to sit in a cage to understand what injustice felt like. Mr. Cooper, Jasmine said, her face lighting up in a way that made Darnell glad he'd stopped. Glad he'd taken the time to check on these two people who had been at the center of why this work mattered. Daddy said you might come by. Darnell knelt down to Jasmine's level, looked at this child who had waited 19 months to hug her father, and he asked, "How are you doing, Jasmine?" "I'm good," she said, and her smile was genuine and unforced. "Daddy picks me up from school now, every day. He says he's never missing another day, never missing another moment, never letting anything come between him and being there for me. Something in Darnell's expression softened the still water, finally rippling just slightly, just enough to show that underneath the composure and the professional distance there was a human being who cared about outcomes and victims and whether the work he did actually mattered in people's lives. "That's good, Jasmine," he said quietly. "That's exactly how it should be." Rosa invited him in for coffee, and he stayed 20 minutes, and they talked about nothing important about the weather and Jasmine's school play and Rosa's garden and all the ordinary things that people talk about when the important things have already been said in courtrooms and press conferences. When Darnell left, when he stood on the porch and prepared to walk back to his car, Jasmine hugged him and Rosa said simply, "Thank you." Darnell nodded, didn't say anything because what was there to say that hadn't already been said, and he drove away from Rosa Tucker's house and out of Ashford City and back to Washington, D.C., where other cases waited, where other investigations needed his attention, where other corrupt police officers were destroying other innocent lives and needed to be stopped. The body camera footage that had been viewed 52 million times became more than a viral video, became more than evidence in a criminal trial, became a teaching tool and a rallying cry and a permanent reminder that truth, when it's documented carefully enough and presented clearly enough, can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The Ashford City Police Department operated under federal consent decree implementing mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters with citizens, restructuring its internal affairs division so that complaints couldn't be buried by supervisors with conflicts of interest, creating independent oversight boards with subpoena power and the authority to investigate misconduct without needing department approval. The changes came slowly, contested at every stage by police unions and city officials who claimed they were impractical or too expensive or would handcuff officers' ability to do their jobs, but they came imperfect and incomplete, but still representing more accountability than had existed before, more transparency than the department had operated with in decades. Blake Harrison's 24-year sentence became case law, was cited in other prosecutions of corrupt police officers, was studied in law schools and police academies as an example of what happens when corruption is exposed completely and prosecuted aggressively, when the federal government decides that protecting civil rights is worth the resources and attention required to build airtight cases. The Alliance for Justice in Policing that Rosa Tucker now co-chaired had expanded to 7 cities across Mississippi, working with families whose loved ones were in prison, claiming innocence, helping them navigate the impossible complexity of appeals and post-conviction relief, providing the kind of sustained advocacy that most families couldn't afford to pay for and couldn't sustain on their own. The work wasn't finished. Would never be finished as long as badges could be used as weapons instead of shields, as long as power could be abused without consequences, as long as some people's testimony was treated as gold, while other people's testimony was treated as noise to be dismissed. But now there was proof that the work could be done, proof that corruption could be exposed and prosecuted, proof that 12 people sitting in cages claiming innocence might actually be innocent and might actually deserve to be believed. Proof that one person refusing to look away could change everything. There is something important to say about this story that is not contained in the verdicts or the headlines or the 52 million views of a 4-minute video. Something about the 12 real people whose lives were destroyed by Blake Harrison and Tony Riggs, and the organized corruption that protected them for 20 years. Isaiah Tucker lost 19 months with his daughter, months he will never get back, moments of her childhood that are gone forever. And while the settlement money and the exoneration and the public vindication matter, they don't restore what was stolen. Don't give him back the time when Jasmine was 8 and 9 and needed her father. And he wasn't there because a corrupt cop decided he was a convenient target. Cameron Ellis lost 31 months of his life, years when he could have been working and building a career and contributing to his community, years spent in a cage for a crime that was manufactured specifically to give Blake Harrison another arrest statistic. and while he got his job back and his freedom back, the record of that arrest will follow him forever in background checks and moments of doubt. Terrence Mills was 19 when he was arrested, just a kid, really, and the 11 months he served interrupted his education and gave him a criminal record, and taught him things about injustice and power that no 19-year-old should have to learn. And while he's rebuilding his life and working toward a degree, the trajectory of his future was altered in ways that can never be fully calculated. Justice is slow, painfully slow, and it's imperfect in ways that leave scars even when it eventually arrives, and it doesn't heal everything it touches, doesn't restore what was taken, doesn't make whole the people who were broken by the machinery that was supposed to protect them. But when it finally arrives, when it undeniably and irrevocably arrives with evidence that can't be denied and consequences that can't be avoided, it arrives with a weight that can crush anything standing in its way. Blake Harrison sat in that courtroom believing he'd already won, believing that the machinery would protect him the way it had protected him 19 times before, believing that his badge and his testimony and his 20 years of service would be enough to make this defendant disappear into the prison system like all the others. He forgot one thing, or maybe he never knew it in the first place. The man sitting in those handcuffs had been building the case against him for longer than Blake could imagine, had been willing to experience what Blake's victims experienced, had been willing to sit in that cage for 43 hours, understanding in his body what injustice felt like, so that when truth finally spoke in that courtroom, it spoke with the authority that comes from complete understanding, rather than abstract sympathy. And that kind of truth that's been lived and documented and presented with meticulous care, cannot be buried, cannot be explained away, cannot be dismissed as the complaints of people who don't deserve to be believed. Jasmine Tucker keeps that newspaper clipping on her desk, and every time she looks at it, she's reminded that her father's innocence was real, that his words mattered, that persistence and documentation and one person's refusal to accept injustice can actually change the world in ways large and small. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., Darnell Cooper is building another case, documenting another pattern of corruption, preparing to sit in another cage, if that's what it takes to understand what another group of victims experienced, because the work is never finished. But it can be done one case at a time, one corrupt officer at a time, one innocent person freed at a time, until the machinery of justice remembers what it was built for and starts serving the people it was designed to protect. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the importance of the work that goes unseen, if it reminded you that ordinary people and extraordinary ones are fighting these battles every single day, in courtrooms and police stations and communities across this country, then do something about it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to be reminded that the truth still matters, that documentation still matters, that refusing to look away still matters. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story we tell, because these stories aren't just entertainment, they're testimonies. They're proof that change is possible when people refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. These aren't just stories we're telling for clicks or views. These are real patterns of corruption being exposed, real people being freed from cages they never deserved to be in, real families being reunited after years of separation. And the audience that makes this work possible, the audience that shares these stories and demands accountability and refuses to let corruption hide in the shadows, that audience is you. Because the stories that deserve to be told deserve an audience brave enough to witness them, smart enough to understand them, and committed enough to demand that the truth they reveal leads to action rather than just outrage. The truth still matters. Justice, however slow and imperfect, still wins when people refuse to give up. And your attention, your sharing, your commitment to holding power accountable still makes a difference in ways both large and small.